Thank you, Ravano, for sharing your knowledge. We've been looking forward to this for over a year. We've been waiting for this seminar to finally take place. Thank you very much. Let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you that we can stand before you. We ask you to bless Ravano as he shares his knowledge freely with us, that you may give him wisdom and understanding, and that we may bring glory to your name. We pray this, not because we're worthy, but in your name. Amen. Thank you, Ravano.
There? Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Welcome to the presentation this morning. I trust you will find it useful. I'm quite nervous to do this presentation for you guys this morning. I normally do this with corporate companies who do food manufacture, so I've tailored it a bit for home preservation. So I hope you'll find it useful. If I mess it up, maybe there's next time, I'll try and make up for you then. Okay. So welcome also to those that's joining us online. Please feel free to ask questions. You can put it in the comments. And for those who are here in person, as I go through the presentation, you can stop me at any time. You won't be interrupting me. If there's something that was unclear, or if you want to share something or ask a question, then I'll try and address it there. If I am going to talk about it later, I will let you know we're going to cover that topic. And then we'll leave it for that part of the talk. Okay. So when we look at the history of preservation, we can see that people on Earth have been preserving foods for thousands of years. If we go back to one of the best history books, the Bible, we find in Genesis chapter 41, we find the story of Joseph in Egypt, and where in the 7 years of plenty, he gathered up as much food as they could, stored it in barns, so that for the following 7 years of famine, that there was food for the Egyptians to sustain the Israelite nation and also some of the other nations around. So we find many examples of preservation. And then a very interesting story, especially for me as a food technologist, understanding how microbiology works, how biochemistry works. When I came across the story in Exodus of the Israelites when they left Egypt and they were in the wilderness, and they didn't have food. And if those of you who know the story, you would remember that God provided manna. And every day, they had to go out and collect the manna. And if they kept any of the manna till the next day, the next morning, they would find that the manna was spoiled. Okay? So it was probably spoiled by bacteria. The Bible also says that there was insect infestation because there was worms. And this happened if you collected it on a Sunday morning and you kept it over until Monday morning, it was spoiled. If you collected it on a Tuesday and kept it over for Wednesday, it was spoiled, and so on and so on and so on, all the way until Friday morning. But then on Friday, something very special happened in this story. On Fridays, the Israelites had to go out, and they had to collect a double portion of manna. Now remember, all the other days, the manna spoiled. But on the Friday, when they collected a double portion, the Saturday morning, the manna was not spoiled. And that was a miracle. So God actually preserved the manna for the Israelites because of their faithfulness in keeping the Sabbath day holy. So there's so many examples that we can go through in history of how people have been preserving food. And the principle hasn't changed much. We've just become a little bit more sophisticated in terms of technology. So what I hope to share with you today, we're going to start off with just a bit about the science of preservation. We're going to look at just a handful of techniques. We're going to look at it broadly, see how they work. Maybe some of them you practice already, so maybe we'll discuss, or maybe you'll have some questions. And then, there's microbiology. This is what either spoils your food, or you can use it to your benefit to ferment foods. Okay? And we're going to look at that. So we'll look a little bit into the history of microbiology. We will talk a little bit about how microorganisms work so that you can understand it better. Because if you can understand it better, you will be able to preserve your food better. So that will be microbiology. Then we will look at chemistry, because when we cook food or when food is harvested, it's not only microorganisms that spoil the food, but there are also biochemical reactions that naturally take place in the food, which we then also need to stop prevent or slow down in order to preserve the food. So we'll look at that in the chemistry section. And then we will look at all the tools that you will need. We have some equipment set up in the foyer, which we will look at later. We will look at what are the main components on that pieces of equipment, why it's there, how it's useful to you to control the processes that you will run when you're doing home preservation. And then at the end, we will also have a demonstration, a live demonstration, where we will actually preserve a food product. And when we finish with that process, that product will be safe to consume for about 18 to 24 months. And the reason why we put a limit on it, it's not because the process is inadequate, but because the packaging will deteriorate after that period of time. Okay, so that's what we're going to cover today. And we hope to do this in the next 3 hours. So hold on to your seats, let's go. Everybody good? Okay, so let's start off with the science of preservation. Now there is many topics that we could have covered in this section, but I've chosen some common ones, ones that are really useful, easy to use, ones that you might be using already. So there's the first one called water activity, which we'll look at in a second. Then we're going to look at pH, chemical preservation, heat treatment, chilling and freezing, and then this funny thing called hurdle technology. And we'll look at it in that order. So what is water activity? If you had to look up a definition for water activity, you will get lots and lots of complicated, highfalutin scientific explanations. But very simply, water activity is a measure of the free and available water. So what do we mean by that? So if you had to take, for example, a jam product. A jam product roughly has about 30 to 35% water. So it's 30 to 35% moisture. But your jams do not spoil easily. You do not need a lot of processing to get it to become shelf stable, because all that water is bound. Okay, the water is not available to bacteria to use. Why? Because of all the sugar that's in the jam. Okay, the same with products where you have a high salt content. When the salt dissolves into the water, when you hit a certain critical level of salt content, that salt actually holds the water and binds it and makes it unavailable to bacteria to use. Okay, so if you had to compare a jam product, which has about 30, 35, sometimes up to 40% moisture, if you compare that to some dried fruit, for example, dried fruit has a really low moisture content, somewhere probably about 15 or 20%. But it's not the moisture content that's keeping the product stable, it is the water activity. So just keep that in mind. So we cannot take a moisture content and relate it to microbial stability. We need to look at what the water activity is. So we'd have to look at what the moisture content is together with whatever is dissolving in that water, whether it be sugar or salt or so forth. So that's just to give you an idea about water activity. So methods that we use to manipulate food's water activity, things that's been done for thousands of years, which is sun drying. So when you harvest something, you'll clean it, maybe you'll slice it up to reduce the diameters so that the moisture can evaporate out of the product more easily, and then you lay it out in the sun. Or you could do forced drying. That's where you put it in a dehydrator, and after a while, maybe after 24 or 48 hours, depending on the product that you're drying, the product would have lost sufficient amount of moisture, and the sugars that was left in the product, if it was a fruit product, would have concentrated to a high enough degree to reduce that water activity, which then makes the product stable. Just some common products that you might come across, and these are their different water activities. So you can see things like biltong, about 0.7, jams, 0.8 and below. Just so by the way, for your information, so water's water activity, so pure water's water activity would be a value of 1. Okay, so as you start binding that water, the number reduces to below 1. Or below 1. So pure water would be 1, and as you start binding the water, the number would reduce to a decimal, basically. So if you look at products like raisins, for example, this is where we sort of reach a threshold, because bacteria, actually no life can exist when the water activity drops to below 0.6. So things like raisins, they're quite close to that. Biscuits, potato crisps, these really, really dry things, their water activity is so low that bacteria would never be able to spoil them. And that's why you can keep your raisins for very long. Your biscuits, though, you can't keep that long. Because what normally happens if you keep your biscuits too long? They go stale. I thought somebody was going to say somebody eats them up. But yes, they go stale. So the definition of stale is what's actually happening is the product is absorbing moisture. Okay? So then that 0.3 starts to climb. So luckily, it will already be undesirable for you to eat if it becomes stale. But if you had to leave it long enough, it would actually start to maybe first develop mold, and then later on bacteria would be able to grow because of the moisture that has been picked up from the environment. We're going to look at some bacteria a bit later, but just to give you an idea, when we manipulate the water activity, we can start preventing certain bacteria from growing. Okay, so this little table here just gives you different types of bacteria. So most bacteria needs a water activity of above 0.91. Then you can stop a lot of bacteria from growing, but not all of them. As we will look at later when we get to the microbiology section, you get lots of bacteria which are what we call halo tolerant. They can withstand quite low water activity environments. So it's good to know about these bacteria so that when you are doing your processing, when you're trying to preserve your foods at home, that you select the correct technique to keep these bacteria under control. Yeasts are a little bit more hardy. They can survive quite low. I know the table says 0.88 over there, but I've already had problems with yeast in the food industry all the way down to 0.6 water activity, just above 0.6. So that's water activity. So that's all I was going to say on water activity. So when you are drying your foods, remember that it is not just the moisture content that is preserving the food, but it is how you are affecting the water activity. So if you're drying the food, let's say you were using salt to dry something, and now you wanted to make it a bit more healthy. So now you want to use less salt. You're going to have a problem, because that salt is actually what's dissolving into the liquid that's in the food or the moisture, which is reducing the water activity. So if you changed your recipe and you started to take away some of the salt, you would now end up with a higher water activity, which means that there would be bacteria that would normally not give you a problem, which will now actually give you a problem and would cause your food to spoil. Okay, is there any questions on drying, water activity, moisture that somebody might have? Yes. Can we move the mic over there?
Ron, hello, is it working? Yeah.
Yes.
Where's the question?
Over here?
No, we just use it for the online.
Okay. Tell me, do you have an alternative for the salt?
Yes. So as we go through the talk, there's many techniques that we're going to cover, and then we're going to look at this hurdle technology at the end of the first chapter of the talk today. So when we're preserving food, we normally use different mechanisms in combination to preserve the food. So if you were, for example, only using drying, so that would be you just evaporating moisture. So you could then add a second step to that. So you're going to dry it, but you're also going to add salt. Okay? So if you wanted to reduce the salt, it means you're now going to have to dry it a lot further than what you would normally dry it. Okay? Or you might want to introduce a second preservation technique. Maybe you're going to refrigerate it. Okay? Or maybe you're going to replace some of the salt with sugar or something like that. Okay? But what you will hear me say as we progress throughout the talk today is when you are doing home preservation, use a trusted recipe and a process. Okay? Try not to change it too much unless you really understand the product and the process. Especially when you're doing things like home canning. Okay? You need to use a trusted recipe and a trusted process. When we get to that chapter, you will see how very small changes even moving from one location to another. If you had to move from Cape Town to Joburg, you cannot use the same process that you were using in Cape Town if you were doing home canning, for example. So these are things that we need to be aware of. We are going to cover that later. For example, just on canning, if you had to move from Cape Town to Joburg and you did home canning, in Joburg you would probably have to cook your products for at least 10 to 15 minutes longer for it to be safe. We'll get to that later. Yes.
One other question, or one question I want to ask you. How do you know when your water activity is, when all your water is bound up, that it's not available to bacteria? How do you know when you've reached that point?
Okay, so that's a good question. It's not easy to observe this visually. So in the food industry, we would use specialized equipment to test this. So when you follow a trusted recipe from a verified source, the person who developed that recipe and posted it or published that recipe would have done these kind of tests on it. So if you follow their procedure, you would end up then with a safe product. When you're doing it yourself, you would have to, unfortunately, use a bit of trial and error. If you're trying something new, so if you had to dry it, I would then leave it for a little while. You would then assess it organoleptically. Organoleptically, what we mean by that is the flavor, the odor, the appearance of the product. Usually the first organisms that's going to start to grow is, okay, the pointer doesn't work, is molds and yeast. Okay, so molds, you're going to see it visually. They will be growing on the surface of the product, then you know you did not reduce the water activity enough. If you start getting a fermented odor, like a beer odor, alcohol odor, then you know it's yeast that is spoiling your product. So you definitely have not dried it enough. And if it looks fine, but it smells ghastly, that you don't even want to taste it, please don't use taste as the first test method. Eh? First look at it and smell it. Yeah, so if you don't see anything wrong, but it smells ghastly, it's most probably bacteria. So then your water activity is far too high. Okay?
Yes, I just wanted to ask, you said that canning, if you can in different areas, it has a response on your canning. So if you're canning in Somerset West, and then you decide to go and can in, like on our farm in Clanwilliam, it's much drier, do you need to adjust your recipe? That's what I'm getting.
You might. So later on, I'm going to get to that. It's all about the altitude and the pressure and the boiling point of water. So I've got a little table that I'll share with you later on. Okay? Good, let's move along. So we're moving on to pH. So again, pH, you can look up different definitions of it. We all know, or if you didn't know, the pH scale is from 0 to 14. So products which are extremely acidic, if we had to test it on the pH meter, and I've got a pH meter outside, we'll test some products later, the pH will be very low. So food products which are acidic are usually in the range of about 3 to 4, around there. And then other products which do not taste sour, they usually have a pH of above 4.5. Okay? Usually, and I will tell you why I say usually. So pH is basically a measure of the acidity in the product. And acidity is a very useful tool when we are preserving food. Just by manipulating the pH, we can either prevent certain bacteria from growing, or we can allow them to grow, depending on which pH range that we are in. So the most common acids that's used in food is citric acid. I think that's the most common one. The reason why it's so common is because it's cheap. It's also very effective. If you add a little bit of citric acid, I've got some in front, so later when we're doing the demonstration, you'll see some of it. But you can add just a little bit of citric acid, and it will cause quite a drastic change in the pH of your product. So citric acid is very common. Vinegar is also something that's used. I don't like to use vinegar, but vinegar is also commonly used. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And simply in home use, you could use lemon juice. So lemon juice is loaded with citric acid. Okay? And lemon juice normally has quite a low pH. So just adding a little bit of lemon juice to the products that you are processing would reduce the pH sufficiently to cancel out the whole spectrum of microorganisms, which we will look at later. So these are quite useful tools. Now, when we look at the processes where we use pH or the acidity to preserve the products, you could either do something like pickling. So this is where you would soak your product in some kind of an acid. Over a period of time, that acid is then absorbed by the product, which changes the pH and makes it shelf stable, or prevents many bacteria from growing and extends its shelf life quite significantly. Other ways that we use it is, let's say you were making a sauce, or like we're going to do later, we're going to do whole peel tomatoes in tomato juice. To control the pH, you can simply just mix some citric acid, or you can add some lemon juice to the liquid portion, and so you incorporate it as part of your recipe. So using acid is quite an effective tool in preserving products. So just before we get to the table over there, I like to use this picture. You all know what that is? Pickled onions, which usually you find, where do you find this? You don't want to say? You normally find it at the fish and chip shop, right? I know none of you go there, but for those who do go there, they normally buy some of this and they'll eat it with their fish and chips as a condiment. And nobody ever asks the fish and chip shop cashier or owner, whoever's serving you, nobody ever asks, what's the expiry date of these pickled onions? Nobody ever asks, was it refrigerated before you took it out this morning? Eh? And the fact of the matter is that probably those onions are very old. Maybe if his business is not doing well, maybe it's even more than a year old. And I can guarantee you that that pickled onions has not seen the fridge ever in its life, even after opening. So why is it that this pickled onions is safe? Because I've never ever heard of an outbreak of people getting some foodborne illness from eating fish and chips because they had some old pickled onions with it. So let's look at the process that's used to make pickled onions. So first you'll start with your onions, and you'd peel your onions. Maybe you'll wash it. Now, if you had to just leave the onions in that state, the onions won't last very long. Okay? Peeled onions, looking at a couple of days maybe, then it will start becoming slimy, it will get a bit of an off odor, and then the onions will be spoiled. But what they do with the onions, after they've peeled it, they then put it in a jar, and they cover it with brown vinegar. Okay? You know the difference between brown vinegar and white vinegar? No? There's hardly any difference. The brown vinegar just has some caramel added to it. Otherwise, there's no difference. Okay? So they use brown vinegar because that's what people like to see. And then after a few days, these onions will miraculously be preserved. And they will last in that container. If that's a metal closure, I would say that metal closure is going to be able to last maybe 12 months or so. If it's a plastic closure, sure, it's going to last forever in there. Okay? And why does it last forever? Or why does it last such a long time? I'm online, so I must be careful what I say. So forever is relative, I mean a very long time. So why does it last for so long? So when you take the onions and you soak it in this vinegar, the vinegar starts to be absorbed by the onions. Okay, it's a process that we call osmosis. So the acid moves from a high concentration to a low concentration. There's a low concentration inside of the onions. Your onion's pH is relatively high, maybe pH 5 point something. Your vinegar is really low, probably somewhere between 2 and 3 on the pH scale. And slowly over time, this acid is absorbed by the onions. And it changes the pH of the onion. Okay? So the pH of the onion drops very low, and all the bacteria that would have spoiled this onion can now not grow because the pH is too low. The acidity is too high. So from a microbial perspective, the onion is now stable. It will not spoil by bacteria. But when you leave an onion for too long, it starts to exude liquid. You know, there's chemical changes that take place. Now, those changes are not caused by bacteria, but they are caused by the natural biochemistry inside of the onion. Now, most of this biochemistry that causes changes in the food is because of enzymes. Okay? Now, enzymes are proteins. So we can also stop enzymes from working, like a light switch. We can switch them on and off, if we know how. Now, what we know about enzymes is all enzymes are proteins. Now, if you imagine, if you took an egg and you crack the shell, you have this transparent portion and you have the yellow portion, and then you put it in a pan and you start to fry it, and this transparent portion just all of a sudden starts becoming opaque, and eventually it turns white. So what's actually happening there is the protein in this transparent portion of the egg is changing shape, and that's why it turns white. Now that process in science we call denaturing. Okay, you're denaturing the protein. So we know that we can use heat to turn enzymes off because they are proteins, so we can damage them. So that's what's happening when you're frying an egg. You're actually damaging that protein, and that's why it changes color. But another technique that we can also use is we can change the pH, because enzymes are very specific. They only work in a very narrow pH band. And as soon as you shift that pH, those enzymes become inactive. Okay? And that's what's happening with onions. So when you change the pH of the onions, you now stop the bacteria from growing, but you also switch off the enzymes. So you stop the biochemical degradation from taking place. And that's why the onions last so long. So I told you I don't really like vinegar. Does anybody know how vinegar is made? Anybody made vinegar? No? So what happens to make vinegar? You first have to make alcohol. Okay, so that's why you get white wine vinegar, or you get apple cider vinegar. So what you have to do, you start off with something that has quite a lot of sugars. So in the case of apple cider vinegar, you'd start off with apple juice. And then you would need to allow this apple juice to ferment into an apple cider. So normally you would use a yeast for that process. So basically you're making apple beer. Now, the yeast would have changed the sugars in the apple into alcohol plus carbon dioxide. Then you would need to add a second bacteria, which we call acetobacter. So what acetobacter does, it actually feeds on alcohol. So this bacteria will then feed on the alcohol and change the alcohol into an acid that we call acetic acid, which is actually the acid in vinegar. Okay? Now, once acetobacter has changed the alcohol into acetic acid, there is no more microbiological processes that can happen with vinegar. So if I had to ask you, if you have vinegar at home, and those of you who do, and I asked you where did you store it in your fridge after opening? No, you would tell me no. And if I asked you where is it, you would say no, it's in the cupboard. And if I asked you how long has it been in the cupboard, you probably don't know. And the reason why your vinegar is stable is because it's basically the final process that bacteria can do. There's nothing more that they can do with vinegar. It's basically an excrement of bacteria. So that's why vinegar is so shelf stable. And when it's used in food preservation, the food also becomes quite shelf stable. Because of its pH, there's a vast spectrum of bacteria that now cannot grow. It has now stopped the biochemical reactions from taking place, and there is no bacteria that can spoil vinegar. So that product is quite safe. So that fish and chip shop owner was actually very clever and very sophisticated when he made his pickled onions that he sells for R2.50 each. Any questions on that?
Spirit and grape vinegar, is there a difference?
Okay, that's okay, Paul. So the question is there a difference between spirit vinegar and grape vinegar? So usually when it's called spirit vinegar, it's been industrially manufactured. Okay, so it wasn't some fruit juice that was used. It was most likely some sort of a glucose mixture, so something high sugar, that was fermented into an alcohol, and then that alcohol was fermented by acetobacter into acetic acid to a very high concentration, and then it's clarified and it's diluted down to about 5%, 6% is what you would normally buy in the shop. Commercially in the industry, when we use it in factories, it's diluted down to about 10%. So that would be spirit vinegar. And if it was grape vinegar, then they would have used some grape juice in that manufacturing process. Okay? Yes. Just wait for the mic. So, okay, sorry. So the question was, would this pickled onion recipe work if you used pure lemon juice? The answer is probably not. Okay? So because vinegar is such a antibacterial acid, if we can call it that, there's very little else you need to do except for soak it in vinegar. Okay? But if you're going to use something like lemon juice, you would maybe need to add something like salt. So you'd need to now have a combination of acidity as well as low water activity. Or you might need to put your product through some sort of a water bath canning process, where you're going to cook it a little bit to kill some of the bacteria. Or you might need to refrigerate it. But lemon juice on its own won't be able to do it. Okay. So coming back to the table that we have at the bottom of that slide, we categorize food according to their pH. And we have all these fancy categories that you see on the screen here. But the one that I want you to remember is highlighted in red. Okay, and that is pH 4.50. So anything above pH 4.50, that is in a very dangerous category. So we call those foods low acid foods. And if you do home canning, you will see in your recipe books they talk about low acid foods or high acid foods. So the low acid foods are the ones that you need to be very careful of. So if the pH is above 4.50, you cannot use water bath canning methods, okay? Because water bath canning only goes up to whatever the boiling point of water is in your area. So in Cape Town, it's probably about 100 degrees. If you had to go up to Joburg or Limpopo area, it's somewhere between 96 and 97. But that would not be able to be used to safely produce a product that has a pH of 4.50 or above. So these are your neutral flavor products, you know, things that don't taste sour. And I'll have to qualify that later, because some things don't taste sour, but they are actually sour. But in most cases, these are your things that don't have an acidic flavor. So if you had to do things like canned vegetables, let's say you're going to do carrots, for example, that does not have a pH of below 4.5. So you wouldn't be able to use water bath canning unless you were going to use a recipe that has acidification as part of it. Maybe it lets you add a certain amount of lemon juice or citric acid. So then it might be safe if it's a verified recipe that you're following. Things like beans, that is very high pH, so that definitely you cannot process on a water bath canning. So an important pH for you to remember is this 4.50 barrier. And the reason why that barrier has been set is because there's a very dangerous bacteria that grows at pH 4.50 and above. We're going to cover that organism later when we get to the microbiology section. This bacteria is so dangerous that if I had a jar that I canned at home and I used a water bath process, let's say it was beans, and I used the water bath process on it, if I opened that jar and I stuck my finger in it and I shook my finger off and I licked my finger once, that would be enough to kill me. Okay? So I wouldn't get sick, I would die. So that's why this pH of 4.50 is a very important barrier. Please don't be scared with what I'm telling you. I'm not here to scare you. We want to educate everybody so that you can do safe home canning. Okay? So once you know, once you have this knowledge, you can produce safer products. So this is definitely not to scare anybody. So if we had to look at this pH scale, so at the bottom of that picture, we have the pH scale going from 0 to 14. That blue line I've put in there as the barrier, you know, that 4.50 that you're never going to forget after today. That's the blue line. And then you can see where different foods sort of fall on the pH scale. Lemons that we were talking about earlier, like the lemon juice, you see that that is fairly low, under 3, probably closer to 2, lemon juice. And then you see that funny green little thing just after the pH 3 line. So that's a gherkin or a pickled cucumber. So cucumbers are normally more neutral, but when we pickle them, they become very acidic, so that's why that's on that side of the scale. And acidity is a good indicator for you to tell you something is wrong. So for example, if you had to taste a mushroom and it tasted sour, then you know there's something wrong with that mushroom because it's not supposed to be there, unless you've acidified it. Okay? So pH is very important. It helps us to identify when we are going to be in a safe zone for different kinds of preservation methods. So it's important to keep this in mind. Okay, so the different processes that we use. So in pickling, you could either just soak it in acid, like we've described with the pickled onions example, or even with pickled cucumbers. But with pickled cucumbers, you would normally add acid plus salt, and there might even be a pasteurization step as well, because it's not going to have as much acid as the pickled onions had. Then there's also other processes that we use. We can use acid blanching. This is where we make an acidic solution, and then you put whatever it is that you want to acidify in a hot solution for a few minutes, and then you drain the liquid off, and then that particulates that was in the liquid would have absorbed enough acid to reduce the pH. So one example of where I've made use of this in the industry is, for example, sandwich bread. Have you've heard of that product? So it's like a mayonnaise with some vegetables in between. Now your mayonnaise, is mayonnaise low pH or is it high pH? Is it sour or is it neutral? Low pH, okay? It's always a sour product. That's why it lasts so long, you know. You can open it, you can keep it in your fridge for quite a long time. It's quite stable because it's actually very sour. In South Africa, we have some of the most sourest, is there a word like that? The most low pH mayonnaises in the world is found here in South Africa. Okay, so South African public really like tangy flavors, where the pH of the product even dips below 3. So now you have this mayonnaise, which is extremely acidic, but you want to put these vegetables inside of it. So that sandwich breads are normally has some carrots, some cabbage, maybe green beans, yeah, whatever the mixture is. If I had to take that vegetables and I had to put it in the mayonnaise and mix it in and fill it into jars and stack it in the warehouse, that product would look perfectly fine for a few days. And then all around the vegetables, I'll have bacteria starting to grow. There will be biochemical degradation of the vegetables because all the enzymes are still active, and it wouldn't have absorbed the acid quick enough from the mayonnaise. So the vegetables will start to become bitter, they will start to lose its structure, and the moisture will start leaching out. And maybe after 2 weeks, that mayonnaise will start exploding or definitely separating, but it will definitely spoil. So to avoid this problem, what we do is we would take that vegetable mixture and we will boil it in an acid. And when it comes out of that acid boiling process or that acid blanching process, the pH of the vegetables is now the same pH as the mayonnaise. So I can drain off the liquid and I can simply mix it into the mayonnaise, and that product will be shelf stable for at least 18 months. Okay, so we can use acid blanching. Or as I've said earlier, you simply just use acid as an ingredient in what you are making, and that should be enough to reduce the pH. We have another question here, Paul. Bram, if you can switch our roaming mic on. It's the lady in the fourth row.
So that acidity can be citric acid?
Yes.
In water that you boil the vegetables in?
It could be citric acid in water or lemon juice. Yes. But like I said before, always follow a trusted recipe and a verified process. Yes?
Okay, no, I just thought that you said just now that the lemon juice doesn't work as well as vinegar.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
It can be used in certain processes where you want to acidify to get your, you see the last point I've made on this note here is about the equilibrium pH. So let's say I'm making a product like, what's a common product? Let's say like chakalaka. You've all seen chakalaka, eh? Chakalaka is a South African word for vegetable curry. So basically what you have in a chakalaka, you've got a tomato base. So it's like maybe tomato paste or fresh tomatoes, which gives you your base, which is acidic. And then you've got vegetables that's added to it. So normally there's some carrots, some cabbage, maybe some green peppers, whatever you're going to add. Now all of those vegetables are high pH. But your tomato juice is low pH. And the process that you're going to have to use to make your chakalaka, because chakalaka needs to have a crunchy texture. So if I had to do pressure canning and take it up to 116 degrees Celsius, I'm going to lose all of that texture. Okay? The vegetables are all going to be soft. So I need to try and do water bath canning method. So I need to go at a low temperature. So I maintain my texture, but I still need to have a safe product at the end of the day. So what you could do there is you could then boil those vegetables in a in lemon juice, for example, or in a citric acid solution before it's added to your mixture. So now your vegetables, so those carrots, cabbage, green peppers, is now at the same pH as your tomato. So now I can do water bath canning. If you cut the vegetables thin enough, then maybe you don't have to boil it in the acid. You can simply just add extra acid to the tomato juice base, and you'd simmer that for a little while to get the acid to penetrate into the vegetables. So at the time when you fill it, your tomato juice base plus the vegetables are all at the same pH. Okay? Good, so that's acidity. So now you know a little bit more about acidity and pH and how this can preserve foods. Just for the sake of completeness, I'll cover chemical preservation very quickly. I'm not a fan of chemical preservation at all. Oh, sorry.
I might have missed it earlier. What is a water bath?
Okay, so you get two basic food canning processes. Okay? The one process is where the canner that you are using has a lid which needs to be kept down with some kind of petcox or something to seal it, or what we would commonly call a pressure cooker. Okay? So when water boils at sea level, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. But so water bath canning would be using water that is simply boiling, and you're achieving about 100 degrees Celsius. If you are up at altitude, it will be a few degrees lower. If you wanted to make a product that had a pH of above 4.5, like we've discussed earlier, then you cannot use water bath canning because the bacteria that you're trying to kill will actually smile at 100 degrees Celsius. That will be unaffected. So you need to go to a much higher temperature of at least about 116 degrees or higher. And to achieve that temperature, you need to have a canner which seals itself off and is able to be pressurized. So then that water inside the pressure canner will reach temperatures of about 116 degrees Celsius. So that's the pressure canner. So pressure canner, if the pH is above 4.5, water bath canner, or just simply boiling your jars in hot water is okay if the pH is below 4.5. Good? Okay. So chemical preservatives, I'm going to just go through this very quickly. This is simply where you take a chemical and you add it to the food, and this chemical will interrupt bacterial processes. Okay? If you read the label on your jars, you will see that nowadays ingredients have these E numbers listed next to it, right? So the reason why many countries do that is so that when you see all these strange chemical names that is difficult to pronounce, you can actually just Google that E number, and you'll get hundreds of websites that will pop up, and then it will tell you what that chemical is, what it's used for, whether it's good or bad. Most of the time, it's not so healthy for you. And the number would normally be somewhere between 200 and 300. So E200 up to about E300, those are all chemical preservatives. So the common ones that you'll find on products today is things like potassium sorbate, sodium benzoate, sulfur dioxide, and there's a couple of others as well. So how these work, they work in one of two ways. So the first way is what we call bacteriostatic. Okay? So it would affect the bacteria, it will stop them from growing, but it doesn't kill them. So the bacteria is still there. And the second way that it works is what we call bactericidal. Okay? So this is where it actually kills the bacteria. But something to keep in mind, if you're going to run a recipe that you found from a verified, trusted source that has chemical preservatives, you need to be sure that you work very hygienically, because these chemical preservatives can only take care of low-level contamination. If you have very high numbers of bacteria, you can throw as much of these chemicals into your product, it won't be able to keep your product stable. Okay? So the rule when working with food is always to work as hygienic as possible. You will see later when we're doing the practical demo, something that in the kitchen we like to do is to taste while we're cooking, right? And we put that spoon back in the pot. That's something we should not do. Our mouths, the human mouth, is extremely contaminated with bacteria, so you don't want to do things like that. So you will see if I taste later, I would use 2 spoons, the one that I'm mixing with, and I'll pour it onto a second spoon, which goes into my mouth. So simple things like that. We'll talk a little bit more about hygiene when we're doing the practical demo. use good quality raw materials as well. It is a myth that bad quality raw materials are used for food processing. If you had to do that, you would really struggle to get the food products to be safe. And the same is true if you're doing home preservation. Don't use the blemished, rotten things for your home preservation because you're making a jam, for example. Okay? You're going to be adding lots and lots of bacteria, and it's going to really put a high degree of stress on your process to deliver a safe product at the end of the day. I'll tell you a quick story about hygiene. So one of my clients had a contamination problem. Luckily, the contamination was not pathogenic. So the bacteria that was growing was not pathogenic. It doesn't harm you at all. It's actually a probiotic that was growing. So it's a good, healthy bacteria, but it is a spoilage organism. It produces gas. It causes products to blow up like balloons, and then they eventually explode. So we needed to get rid of this, and it was a huge amount of stock that had this contamination. So we worked out a safe process, how to rework some of the stock, so we didn't have to discard all of it. And this client was very far away. It took me two plane trips plus a 4-hour drive to get to this client, so it was a long way away. The production manager couldn't wait for me, and he thought, why do we need you? We'll just do the reworking ourselves. So then what he did was he took this food product that was spoiling, and he put it in the beginning of his process and heated it up to a high temperature, and then it goes into another process where it goes to an even higher temperature, and it's held for a certain amount of time to kill all the bacteria, and then it gets packaged in the packaging. So I arrived in the afternoon, and he started this process the morning. When I arrived in the afternoon, the first packages that he filled that morning was starting to blow again. Okay? Even though he used a very high temperature, and he extended the holding time for longer than what he usually uses, and it was because the initial load of bacteria was far too high. Okay? So if you use unacceptable quality raw materials, then your process that you use, even if it's from a trusted, verified source, will not be sufficient to render that product stable. So only use ingredients that you are willing to pick up and take a bite of it. Okay? Okay, that's chemical preservation. Then let's go to heat treatment. Heat treatment is a very effective way of controlling bacteria. As soon as you start heating up the food, you start killing bacteria, microorganisms, bacteria, yeast, and mold. You'll start killing them. What you will also do, as I explained earlier with enzymes, you'll start to inactivate the enzymes. I'm going to ask Seth to help me now. Seth, hold up the carrot. Show everybody the carrot. Hold it up in there. Okay, so you see there's a normal carrot. It's not a magic carrot. It's a normal carrot. What we're going to do, we're going to do a quick demonstration now. We're going to show you how we can switch these biochemicals on and off, the enzymes. Okay? So if you take that carrot, for example, the moment you start cutting, as it stands there, all the enzymes are switched off. There's nothing happening with the enzymes. But as soon as we cut that carrot, as soon as we expose it to air, the inside, as soon as we take the peel off or get to the inside of that carrot, immediately the enzymes are going to be switched on, just like a light switch. And they're going to be working extremely rapidly. Okay? But we can switch them off. And we want to switch them off to give us a chance to prepare all our raw materials so that we can make a batch of whatever we're making when we're doing home preservation. So I'm going to show you how quick and how rapidly these enzymes are actually working, because you can't see it with your eye. But I've got some chemicals there which we are going to use to show the reaction. So what I'm going to ask now, Seth, you can start grating the carrot for us. And then I will let you know when we need the hot water. So a common process that is used when we talk about heat treatment is blanching. You all heard of blanching? You use it? I know many people use it if they have a huge cabbage or something, and then you're not going to eat all of it at once, so then maybe you'll chop it up and then you'll just blanch it a little bit in boiling water. So blanching is where you just cook something in just normal water. And the reason we use water is because it's an easy way to increase the temperature of the food. So you just give it a little blanch, and then you can put it in your freezer, and it will last for quite a long time. No chemical degradation. and you're using the low temperature in your freezer to control the bacterial growth, right? So you're using a dual method. So when we use heat treatment, it inactivates enzymes, but what we also need to be aware of is that it will change the color, the flavor, and it will also alter the texture of your food. So it doesn't matter that what you have preserved is now safe for 18 months or 2 years. If it doesn't taste nice, if it doesn't look nice, nobody's going to want to eat it. So you need to make your foods desirable as well. So when we're using heat, we can't simply just say, oh, I'm going to leave it in the water bath for however long I want to leave it there, because then the food is going to become quite degraded in terms of heat damage. Okay? It might be overcooked, it might be burnt, it might have lost texture, it might end up like baby food or something like that. Okay? So we need to be aware of the changes that takes place. So the processes we use when we're using heat to preserve foods, some products are safe enough for you to simply just hot fill. So if you're making, for example, let's say you're making a jam. A jam normally has a very low pH. The pH of jams are usually around pH 3. Okay? That's for the pectin to work. If your pH isn't there, your jam won't have a good set. So it has a very low pH. So when you heat your jam up to boiling and you fold it, you don't have to do anything else. You can simply close it and put it in cold water to cool down, and that would be enough to keep your jam stable. If you add the right amount of sugar, and if you add the right amount of acid. So you need to use a trusted, verified recipe. So jams usually have a Brix. Brix is a quick test that we used related to sugar content. It's not 100% sugar content, but it tells us about what the amount of sugar is in the jam. You can get little refractometers, which are quite inexpensive. I've got one inside, so we will look at some products. You simply just put a drop on it, and you look into the light, and then you can read what the Brix is. So a jam usually has a Brix of around about 60 to 65, and that's the amount of sugar that's in the jam. 60 to 65% is sugar, and then it will have most of the time it naturally has a high acid content, so there's a low pH because of the fruits that's being used. But I think in every single jam recipe, it will tell you to add either citric acid or lemon juice to reduce the pH even further, because we need to get that pH down to 3. And if jam is heated up to 88 degrees Celsius, it kills all the microorganisms that's able to grow. Thank you very much. Thank you. I forgot we got a table. Can I have the hot water also, please? So jam, when it's heated up to 88 degrees Celsius, it kills off the last yeast that is able to grow in jam. And then if you fill it into a nice clean jar that's either been preheated or sterilized and there's no other contamination, you simply fill it, you turn the jar upside down. Do you know why we turn it upside down? Because the lid also needs to receive some of this high temperature, because there might be some bacteria on the lid. So whenever you fill, you seal it tightly, and then you turn it upside down. So then the temperature in the jam will actually sterilize the lid as well. And that's good enough for hot filling. If you were making a chutney generally also has about 60% sugar, and thank you very much. And it also has a pH which is quite low, probably around about pH 3.2, pH 3.4, around about there. So the same process applies. You can simply just heat it up, hot fill it, close it, turn it upside down, and cool it down. So that's hot filling. Then you get other products where you might need to hot fill it, but hot filling is not sufficient to keep that product stable, so you will have to then refrigerate it. So this is things like, let's say you were making a soup which has a pH of above 4.50. So you remember there's this dangerous bacteria that needs to be killed. But now you didn't put it through a pressure canner, so it won't be a shelf-stable product. Okay? So you would need to do a little bit of cooking. I'll show you later how much cooking you'd need to do to inactivate certain of the family member of this group of dangerous organisms. And then if you keep it refrigerated after that, you would have a shelf life of about 2 to 3 months. Then there's pasteurizing and sterilization. So these are terms we use interchangeably, but it's not. It's two very different things. So when we do water bath canning, so when we're just using water up to its boiling point of 100 degrees Celsius, that's pasteurizing, okay? Anything 100 degrees Celsius and lower, that's pasteurizing. And a good way to remember it is pasteurizing, you're not killing everything, you're only killing a small spectrum of microorganisms, the ones that are able to grow in your product. Okay? When we go over 100 degrees Celsius, like we do with pressure canning, then we are actually sterilizing the product. Okay? So that's the difference. Pasteurizing is low temperature, sterilization only happens when you are 116 degrees and above. So let's come back to this enzymes. So I'm going to take half of it and put it here. So you remember, we've cut the carrot, and as soon as we've cut it, the enzymes were switched on, and they are actually starting to work. The enzymes, as we speak now, are starting to degrade this carrot. They're breaking down the whole structure. There, can you see it happening? No, you can't. But it is happening. But we can switch these enzymes off. So like you do when you're doing blanching, let's take this one. I'm going to add some hot water. I hope it's hot enough. And we're going to give it a minute or two. And that should be enough to denature the enzyme. So the same like when we're frying an egg, and that liquid portion changes from transparent to opaque and to white, that same thing is happening now with the enzymes inside of the carrot. The enzyme is a long folded up molecule, and now that I'm adding heat to it, that molecule is becoming unstable, it's starting to unfold, and as it unfolds, there are pieces that are breaking off. So I'm damaging this enzyme so that it cannot fulfill its function anymore. And that function at the moment is to degrade the carrot. So I don't want the carrot to degrade. So we're using heat to denature the enzyme. We'll leave that for a minute, and then we'll come back to it. Another preservation technique is chilling and freezing. So chilling, refrigerating, if you had to measure the temperature of a good working refrigerator, it should average around about 4 degrees Celsius. Okay? And if your freezer was working really well, it should get up to about -18. So sometimes we put things in the refrigerator or in the fridge or in the freezer, and we forget about it. But we shouldn't, because what happens when you put something between 0 and 4, which is where your fridge runs at, you are not preventing bacterial growth. All you are doing is slowing the bacteria growth down. Okay? So there are still bacteria that will grow in your fridge. I'm sure you've come across that when you cleaned your fridge out and you found something there at the back that you forgot about. You would see that it's quite spoiled, even though it was in the fridge. And even though you have a generator and load shedding doesn't affect you, it would still spoil. But if you put something in the freezer, that would actually stop the growth of many, many bacteria. But bacteria are very clever little organisms, and there are a vast variety of them. So some of them are actually able to grow at very low temperatures, which you need to be aware of. The big problem that we have with refrigeration and freezing, especially with freezing, is when you need to thaw that product out. So when you use freezing as a method of either preserving your food for a long time or interim preservation, maybe you're going to freeze it and you're going to can it later, or you're going to use it for something later, try and freeze small packages. So don't freeze 10 kilogram bags at a time. The reason for that is when you defrost it, it's going to take a long time to defrost. And we are normally quite in a hurry when we're busy processing our food. So you're going to try and force that defrosting process to take quite quick. So 10 kilos is not going to fit in your microwave, but maybe you're going to leave it on the table in the sunshine. Maybe you're going to put it in warm water to try and to get it to defrost quicker. So what happens now is you increase the temperature on the outside of this package. Okay? Now you remember it was the frozen temperature of -18 that was keeping this product stable. Now in your defrosting process, the outside reaches room temperature, 20, 25 degrees Celsius, while the inside is still frozen. So the outside is starting to degrade because microorganisms are starting to grow there. Enzymes might also start to become active. And by the time the middle of it is frozen, the outside of it is already spoiled, and then you've wasted your 10 kg block. If you freeze it in smaller portions, maybe 1 kg blocks, that's much quicker to defrost. So by the time the product has defrosted, there wouldn't have been a high amount of microbial spoilage or enzymatic degradation, so your product would be quite safe still. So always use smaller pack sizes when you are using chilling or freezing. All good? Let's look at what's happening here. So okay, so on this one, we've flicked that light switch and we've turned the enzymes off. Oh, it's hot. And on this one, they are still quite active. So the enzymes in carrots, the name of the enzyme is called peroxidase enzyme. The easy way to identify whether something is an enzyme, it normally ends in ASE. So if you hear anything like peroxidase, it's an enzyme. So this enzyme, one thing it can do is, it's in the name peroxidase. So what it can do, it can actually break down peroxide. So I've got some hydrogen peroxide here. So hydrogen peroxide, for those of you who remember from your science days in school, water is H2O, right? And hydrogen peroxide is H2O2. There's a hydrogen per oxygen, okay? So there's hydrogen peroxide. So it just has one extra oxygen molecule compared to water. Water you can drink, it's good for you. If you drink this one with the extra oxygen, you will die. Okay, so it's a very different chemical to water. So what the peroxidase is going to do, it's going to chop that oxygen molecule off the H2O2. So I'm going to end up with water plus oxygen. And the oxygen I'm going to be able to see quite easily because it's going to start bubbling out of the hydrogen peroxide. Or if the peroxidase enzyme is switched off and I add the peroxide, nothing's going to happen. So let's hope it works. Otherwise, I'm going to be very embarrassed. Okay. So we'll do the one that's been switched off first. So there's nothing much happening. So the enzyme is probably switched off over there. And then let's look at the one that's not switched off. You see the difference? So the only difference is the enzymes is active in this one, okay? So we don't see it with our eye, but it's there, and look how quickly it's working. As soon as I poured it in, it starts chopping up the H2O2. So now we're left with water, and we've got oxygen that's bubbling off into the headspace. Okay? So although we can't see these things, they are there. They are degrading the food. We need to be aware of them, and we need to keep them under control so that the food can be preserved. We get to the last topic that I have under the first chapter, which is preservation, and it's this thing called hurdle technology. So as the name says, it's named after the athletics race, you know, where the people run and then they have to jump over these little hurdles. In Afrikaans, I think it's called hekkies. So they have to jump over the hekkies. So hurdle technology is something that, a term that we use in microbiology and food preservation to describe how we are going to preserve foods. And actually, most foods are preserved with hurdle technology. So what hurdle technology means is if all the bacteria had to run this race, okay? So the runners in the race is the bacteria that's going to spoil the food. Each hurdle in the race is a different preservation technique. So when the bacteria gets to the first hurdle, maybe that first hurdle is acidification, okay? So I've acidified my food. So when the bacteria gets to that hurdle, all the bacteria that cannot grow in this pH won't be able to jump over that hurdle. So they're going to stay there. But the bacteria that can grow at this low pH is going to jump over. So it means I need to put a second hurdle in place to stop these bacteria that got over the first hurdle. So maybe I'm going to use chemical preservation. Sorry. Oh, it was too late. Maybe I'm going to use chemical preservation. And then of the bacteria that got over the first hurdle, chemical preservation might stop some of them, but then there might be a few that still gets over. So then maybe I'll need to add a third hurdle, which maybe is going to be pasteurization. And that stops the last few bacteria, and none of the bacteria reaches the finish line. If any of them reaches the finish line, that means your food got spoiled. So when we are preserving food, we make use of hurdle technology. So you might think that you are just doing water bath canning, or you think you are doing pressure canning, but it's not just that one step. The hygienic practices that you are using is a very important part of preservation. Okay? Making sure that you wash and sanitize your hands before you touch food. Okay, that's very important. Making sure that the surfaces that the food is on, as well as the utensils, the pots, the spoons, everything that you're going to be using is all sanitized before you use it. Making sure that the environment that you are using is also a clean environment. Okay? So we can't do our food preservation because, let's for example say we needed lots of space. And now you've got space in your garage next to where the dirt bin is standing. That's not a suitable place to do food preservation. Okay? So the environment must be conducive to preserving, to making sure that you have a hygienic environment. All of these things working together will make sure that the product is safe. Let's just wait for the mic. Yes, you can go ahead.
When we talk about making sure that our food is clean and everything is clean, I've been wondering, like, if you soak your vegetables in a salt water for like 20 minutes, I've been doing that, and then sometimes people say you have to soak it in an apple cider vinegar. Is that efficient for killing the bacteria on the skins?
Let me ask you what product you're going to make out of that.
Say if I ferment veggies, and I want to make sure that my veggies are clean before I use them.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that question. Good question. So when we are, and that's why I asked what you're going to make with it. When we are fermenting products, okay? When we are fermenting products, fermentation means we are going to use bacteria which are non-pathogenic, so these bacteria don't make you sick. In most cases, they are good for you. They are probiotics, so they aid in digestion. They live in your digestive tract. And if they are there, you are actually a healthy person. Your immune system is strong. So you actually want these bacteria to be part of your body. If you are going to use them for fermentation, then they have to be on whatever you are processing. So if you are fermenting something, I would say wash it well. Washing does not remove lots and lots of bacteria. It will only remove a small portion. So in that case, your washing process is more for removing foreign objects, soil, whatever might be stuck on the outside of the fruit or vegetable that you are fermenting. But you would be retaining much of the natural bacteria on that product, and most of that is now going to be used in your fermentation process. So then normal washing with water or with salt water is quite fine. Washing with vinegar could also be okay, but it depends what type of fermentation you're going to do. So just give me an example of a product, what actual fruit or vegetable?
We usually do carrots, spring onion,
Okay. So almost like a kimchi type of a thing. Yeah. So in that case, you are most likely doing what we call a lactic acid fermentation. So lactic acid bacteria, they only grow at low pH. So using the vinegar is actually going to help your process, because if there is a residue of acid on the outside of the vegetable mix that you are using, it's actually going to stop all the bacteria that you don't want to grow, but the lactic acid will grow because they don't mind the low pH. Okay? Okay, let's hear the online question, and then we'll come to the other question here.
Okay, Glenda Langford has got a question.
Can you just speak up a bit?
Sorry. Glenda Langford has got a question. Do the carrots spoil while I make salad?
So it all depends on how long you're going to keep those carrots. The longer you keep it, the more chemical degradation will take place. If you are going to make your salad and you've made it, let's say 15, 20 minutes before the meal, you're going to now eat it with that meal. After the meal, you maybe have some more carrot salad left over and you put it in the fridge and you're going to eat it a bit later that day, it should be fine. Maybe even the next morning, it should be fine as well. But what you will notice when the carrots start degrading, you will start noticing a bitter taste. You will start noticing excessive liquid in your salad. That's because the enzymes are starting to break down the structure. But a quick and easy rule, especially when it comes to microbial spoilage, you're going to smell and taste that there's a problem long before we get to a stage where the actual number of bacteria is unacceptable. So if your carrots start to taste sour, which they should not be, then you know that you've kept it too long. That would normally take, if it wasn't refrigerated, it would be a couple of hours, and that carrots will start to go sour. If you do refrigerate it, maybe after a day or so, then the bacteria would have spoiled it. I hope I answered your question. Okay, one more, yeah?
I just want to answer on the hydrogen peroxide rinsing your vegetables. I did some fermentation about 2 months ago, and I rinsed my vegetables in not pure, but with water and hydrogen peroxide, and the vegetables really fermented very well. So it was my first try, and I just want to say that it did work. It didn't do any damage, or it didn't stop the fermenting process.
Okay. How much, just before you go, how much water and hydrogen peroxide, and what was your vegetable
about
mix?
10. I had the food quality hydrogen peroxide, 100%, and on 10 liters, I used about a quarter cup.
A quarter cup.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
10 liters. Okay, good. So hydrogen peroxide is a sanitizer. We use it in the food industry as well. We sanitize surfaces with it. What you need to remember, so what you would have, when you added your hydrogen peroxide to the water and you added your vegetables into that water, there would have been a small reduction in bacterial load. Okay, so that it would have killed some bacteria. But hydrogen peroxide, when we use it as a sanitizer, we normally use it as a surface sanitizer, and it must be used after a washing step. So what happens is, let's say you wanted to sanitize your surface at home. Okay, then you wouldn't just put, let's say you were grating the carrots and the carrots are all over your surface. You can't spray the surface with hydrogen peroxide, because what will happen with most sanitizers, when, especially strong oxidizers like the hydrogen peroxide, as soon as it comes in contact with organic material, the organic material neutralizes the hydrogen peroxide. So then it loses its sanitizing effect. So to use it as an effective sanitizer, you first need to wash your surface, make sure it's clean, that there's no organic residue. So then all that's left on your surface is the microorganisms that you can't see. And then you'd spray it with your hydrogen peroxide, and then the hydrogen peroxide will oxidize those organisms and kill them. But if you use it directly on vegetables, which is organic, especially if you cut it open and there's high surface area, a lot of the H2O2 will become inactivated quite quickly. So it might help with the cleaning process, but it might not kill off a lot of microorganisms. So that's why your fermentation still worked quite well.
Good. We had another question.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to ask also about, because I heard about the hydrogen peroxide washing of veggies, and they say it's a quarter cup of 3% hydrogen peroxide on a gallon of water. That is about 3.7.
A quarter cup
liter.
on a gallon.
Yeah, they say it's 3,000. Well, it's 3.4 liters of water.
Yeah, yeah.
And
so it's quite a low concentration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when it's a light skin with like lettuce and stuff, 20 minutes, and then wash it off. And with harder skin things, 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Then it would preserve it nice.
Yeah, yeah. You see with a lot of crops like lettuce, cabbage, those kind of things that's irrigated, a lot of times, depending on where it came from and where it was harvested, the water that's being used for irrigation is not tap water like we have in our homes. So it's pumped from a river or dam or something like that. And in many cases, this water is quite contaminated. So it will have things like E. coli in that water. It might even have some viruses in the water as well. So that's why it's good that you do wash your vegetables well before you use it. And it's good, if you're not doing fermentation, is to use something like a Multons or H2O2 peroxide or salt water or something like that. Just to get rid of, especially if you're going to make a salad that you can eat straight away, then you don't need the bacteria for any fermentation. Then you really wash it well. But if you're going to use hydrogen peroxide as a sanitizer, or even a chlorine, like a Multons or Jik, something like that, I would suggest that you first rinse it well and then do the sanitizing step. So then you remove a lot of the organic material and you give the sanitizer a better opportunity to kill bacteria. Okay?
A while ago we made some sauerkraut, and I couldn't understand why it all went off.
Okay.
But I'm understanding something you said now. It could have been the water we used to wash the cabbages off. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
It could be a number of things. I actually have a sauerkraut process that we're going to go through later. So let's, when we get to that section, see if you did anything differently, and then maybe we're going to find out why your sauerkraut didn't work. Okay? Okay, let's move along. So that's the end of the preservation section. We're going to move on to microorganisms next. You all still good? I'm so glad nobody fell asleep yet. Yes.
Just want to tell everybody, this will be recorded. So I see a lot of you taking notes. It will be available on YouTube if you want to watch it again.
Okay. Maybe after this section, we'll have a little leg stretch before we go on to the following section. Is that okay? You all still good? Okay. Okay, so in the microbiology section, I'm going to start off with a bit of history of where the study of microbiology came from. We're going to look at the different microorganisms, bacteria, yeast, and mold. They are actually three different things, so we're going to look at that. We're going to look at how they grow. We'll look at the factors that affect how bacteria grows. Because if you know that, you can also reduce bacterial growth rates, or you will understand which part of your process that you are using to preserve the food will result in rapid growth and which other parts where it will be less growth. So then you know how much time you have for each of the steps that you're following. And then we're going to look at some specific microorganisms. I'm going to tell you all their funny names, what they do, and we're going to get to that dangerous one that we spoke of that grows in pHs above 4.50. Let's get started. So in the old days, and I think maybe still some people believe it today, but there was this thing called, or what people believed, they believed in spontaneous generation. So what is spontaneous generation? It's, for example, if you had dirt, garbage, or maybe some meat products laying outside, and you came back maybe 2 days later, and it's now really smelly, and then you will see these white little worms crawling around on the meat. Now, in the old days, the people believed that those white worms actually grew out of the meat. So the meat actually created or made these white worms. Okay? And that's the concept of spontaneous generation. So meat actually somehow changed itself and became a worm, which we know is not true. But there was the scientist at the time who decided he needs to study this because it doesn't make sense to him. Because how can a piece of meat make a worm? So what he did was, he took a piece of meat and he left it on the table. And next to it, he put a second piece of meat and he covered it with a gauze or a bandage. And then he had a third piece of meat, which he covered with a net. And then over the next couple of days, he observed what was happening. And he saw there was flies flying around, and he kept a record of everything. And after 2 or 3 days, he noticed that the meat that was left exposed on the table had these white worms on top of it. The one that had the gauze had white worms on the gauze, but no white worms on the meat. And the other piece of meat that was covered with a net, there was no worms anywhere. So he concluded after the study that the white worms must be from eggs that the flies laid on the meat, which hatched into larvae, which are these white worms, maggots, that we call it today. And the maggots or the white worms did not just grow out of the meat. So he now discovered that there are things that cannot be seen with the naked eye. So there are things like fly eggs that is invisible. So this sparked the interest in the study of small things or microbiology. Then later on, in the late 1600s, there was another scientist, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who actually invented the first microscope using simple lenses. He was able to magnify things, and this is a newspaper article published at the time with sketches that he made of what he saw on the first microscope. So, you know, late 1600s is not that long ago, a couple of 100 years ago. Microbiology is quite a new science, but we've come a long way since the 1700s to now. And then when we get to the history of preservation, there was a French scientist, Nicolas Appert, who was doing some research on food. It was actually not food, it was wine. It was a very big problem that his wine was going off, so he decided to do some studies to see why it was going off. And then he discovered in the late 1700s that if he removed the air, he could make his wine last longer. Okay? So he discovers that air causes spoilage. And these are all concepts we're going to use in the practical demo later when we do a home canning exercise. And at the same time, while he's doing his research, the French are at war in Europe. Napoleon is leading the army, and Napoleon has a huge problem. As he conquers more and more of Europe, he discovers that his army needs to eat, and food only lasts so long. And for him to win the war, he needs to have a preservation technique, that he can take the food with him, that it will stay fresh and nutritious for his army, for his soldiers to eat. So he puts out a reward for anybody who can come up with a preservation technique to make the food last longer, so that he can feed his soldiers and he can win the war. So in the late 1800s, Nicolas Appert takes up the challenge. He does lots and lots of research, and he actually develops the first canning process. So he takes food, he fills it into jars. They don't have metal closures like we have today, but they do have cork. So he cuts out the cork, he plugs the jar, but the cork doesn't seal the jar properly. So then he takes wax and he melts it around the cork so that he can get an airtight seal. And he boils it for quite a long time. And after many years of research, he presents the data to Napoleon. Napoleon is blown away that this food can actually last so long. And Nicolas Appert wins the 12,000 francs, and that begins the canning process that we know today. There's other people in the history of preservation, like Louis Pasteur, for example, who developed this pasteurization technique, which does not kill all the bacteria, but it kills some of them, which extends the shelf life of products. And that brings us to where we are today, where we have volumes and volumes of information about bacteria, especially food spoilage bacteria. We understand it quite well, and that's why we can preserve food so effectively today. So if you look at the organisms that we are trying to control, it's bacteria, yeast, and mold. All of them make up what we call microorganisms. Now, these are drawn to scale. The small little dot on top, relative to the other two, that's the size of a bacterial cell. It's very small. Mold cell is a little bit bigger, and then your yeast cell, the yeast cell is a little bit bigger, and the mold cell is the biggest of the lot. Now, all of these are invisible to the naked eye. They are far too small for us to see. But when they grow and multiply, and when there is many of them grouped together, for example, mold. I'm sure you've all seen mold growing on bread or some type of baked product. Now, what you are seeing there is millions and millions of mold. But you see it quite early on because the cells are quite big. So when they are grouped together, they become visible to the naked eye. Yeast and bacteria are so small, it's very difficult for you to actually spot them on food. But when something's spoiled by bacteria, you will smell it and you will taste it. That there's something wrong, but oftentimes you won't be able to see the actual organism because it's so small. But they are there. Now, in microbiology, when we do what we call microscopy, or when we look at microorganisms under the microscope, there is very little that we can tell. We can only tell how thick or thin the cell wall is of the microorganisms. Remember, these organisms are single-cell organisms. So one little bubble. Okay? Everything happens in the one cell. So if we use a staining technique that we call gram staining, we'll be able to tell whether the microorganism has a thick cell wall or a thin cell wall. That's interesting to us because if it has a thick cell wall, it means it's going to be a little bit more resistant to heat. You're going to heat it up. You're going to have to heat it up to higher temperatures to kill that organism. Compared to a different organism which has a thin cell wall, which we call gram-negative, they will be fairly easy to deactivate with heat. So that's what we'll be able to see. We'll be able to see the shape of the organism. There's only two shapes that microorganisms come in. They're either round little circles, which we call cocky, or they're in little rods, which I'll show you a picture of now. So it's either circles or rods. That's all we're going to see. We might be able to see whether these organisms can move. Some microorganisms can actually swim around. So the way we would notice that, and I'll show you a picture of it later, the organism will have little tentacles coming out of the cell wall. We call those tentacles flagella, and they use that to actually move around in the food. Because microorganisms, when they grow, they produce toxic chemicals. That's the off odors and off smells and the things that makes you sick if you do consume those foods. But those things also become toxic to the microorganism itself. So then they'll stop growing in that area of the food and they might swim to a new area and continue growing there. So that's what we'll be able to see. And sometimes inside of the cell, you'll see a little bubble. And I'll show you some of those bacteria later. And the little bubble or that little seed inside of the cell is what we call a spore. And when you see that, then you know that this organism is extremely heat resistant. Like this dangerous organism I was telling you about that grows at pH 4.5 and above. It actually is what we call a spore former. So you could kill the organism at just under 100 degrees Celsius, but although the organism is dead, the spore is left behind. Think of the spore as a seed, okay? And later on, when the conditions become favorable, that seed will germinate into an organism, it will grow, it will produce its toxin, and whoever consumes that food will die, if it was this particular organism that I'm speaking about. But when we look at it under the microscope, there's not much else than this that we can see. So this is not a normal microscope picture over here, but this is a very powerful microscope. Here you're looking at rods. That's what the organism looks like. You can see it's blue in this color, in this picture. This has been through a staining process, so this has a thick cell wall. So this is what we would call gram-positive. It will be very difficult to kill this organism. Not impossible, but difficult to kill this organism with heat. Or what you will get is little rods. So that's what the bacteria looks like, little circles. And what I want you to notice is that by simply looking at the organism under the microscope, there's absolutely no way you can tell what organism this is. So there's very little that you can tell by just looking at it under a microscope. So what we would normally do, what you are looking at here, is a little Petri dish or little, let's call it a plastic little saucer. When we're doing tests in the lab to grow the bacteria, to identify it, we will use this little Petri dish. There's a special jelly, let's call it a jelly mixture that we make called agar. And there's different nutrients that we put in there that selects for different bacteria. We'll put a little sample of the food in this jelly, mix it up, and then leave it. The jelly sets, and wherever there's an organism, once we incubate this plate, each of those circles that you see there is billions of bacteria, which started off being one cell. So we can simply count the number of circles that we see on the plate, and that will tell us how much organisms was in the sample that we were testing. Okay, so this is how we do microbiology, how we test food. So these organisms, they grow quite rapidly, and they've been studied extensively. Excuse me. And this is the way that bacteria grows. So first, we have what we call the lag phase. So if you have viable bacteria, let's say you have not killed all the bacteria that is able to spoil your food product, things will look normal for the first period of time. You see the line is flat. The bacteria is active, but the number of organisms is not increasing. The reason for this is bacteria is not like us humans. They don't have an internal digestive tract like we do. They have to digest everything outside of the cell. So what the organism is doing in that lag phase, it's detecting what kind of nutrients is around it, and now it's producing enzymes that it's going to excrete, which is going to digest the food around it, so that it can use those broken down particles to produce chemicals. Okay, and that's how the organism is going to grow. So the organism is active, but it's not multiplying. So that's why the product always looks normal straight after you've made it. But once the organism has now produced all the enzymes and all the things that it needs for growth, very rapidly it will start to multiply. Okay? And it will grow very fast. I will show you the numbers very, very soon after this. And then we get to that stage on top. So the fast growing stage we call the log phase or the exponential phase. Then we get to that flat line on top where it looks like the organism stopped growing. But it actually hasn't stopped growing. Microorganisms don't have a very long lifespan. So the organisms that started growing here in the beginning, they start to die. Okay? So the death rate equals the growth rate. So that's why the number stays flat, but there's actually a huge amount of microbial growth taking place. And then we get to the end where the numbers start to decline. This is because, let's say, for example, you had too much air inside your container. The bacteria has now used up all the oxygen, and they cannot grow without oxygen, although there's other bacteria that will grow in the absence of oxygen. But this particular organism will then start to die. If it's a yeast that is spoiling your food, and you're getting that alcohol, beer odor, the yeast actually produces so much alcohol, and alcohol is a sanitizer, it kills bacteria, so then the alcohol it produced starts to kill itself. Okay? So then, but something will go wrong, and the bacteria will start to die. So how do this bacteria multiply? So bacteria is not like humans. One bacteria doesn't see the other bacteria and say, hey, you're good looking, let's go on a date. And then they get married and have children. That's not how it works. The bacteria simply just splits itself in half. Okay? And the process that they use this process that we call binary fission, not fusion. Eh? Fusion is to come together. Fission is like fissure, to cut. So the cell simply just splits in half. So one cell becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, and so on and so on and so on. And this is a very effective way of growing. So the numbers can increase very dramatically, very quickly. Let me ask you to guess. There's one organism which is a problem to us in the food industry. Its name is Clostridium perfringens. The reason why I've chosen this organism is because this organism is one of the fastest growing organisms that we know of. Okay? It goes through this doubling or this binary fission process every 10 minutes. It will double. So let's, for example, say you had just one Clostridium perfringens cell in your product, or let's say it's in your raw material that you're going to process. And now you've had an interruption. I was going to say Seven de Laan came on TV, but that I heard is not on TV anymore. But you had an interruption, and you've left all your things, and you went somewhere, and you came back later. Let's say you left all your things for 5 hours. That one cell, if it's doubling every 10 minutes, how much would you say? Take a guess. Don't calculate it, just take a guess. How much do you say? Any takers? Millions? So that one cell, after 5 hours, would be over 1 billion cells. Okay? And let me tell you, you will never ever find one cell. Okay? It will always be found in hundreds or thousands or 10,000. Fresh produce, it's quite common. I've seen, when we buy raw materials in the food industry, it must come with a specification sheet which says it must comply to these standards. And for fresh produce, it is not common to see on a specification sheet that it will have more than 1 million organisms per 1 gram of material. Okay? So it's never going to be one cell. So when we're working with food, it's important for us to understand how microbiology works, how the microorganisms grow, because very quickly things can go wrong if we make just a little small mistake. Okay? Luckily, you're going to smell it, you're going to taste it, you're going to maybe even see it before it's going to make you sick. Okay? And like I said earlier, when you testing something, or when you're first going to eat something that you've preserved, let's say you've preserved a batch of peaches in sugar syrup or in juice, whatever you made, don't just open a jar and stick a peach in your mouth. You know, open it, have a look, have a smell, and then taste little bits at a time before you actually consume large amounts. So bacteria are not to be messed with. They are quite serious when they spoil food. So what are these factors that affect how fast or slow they're going to grow? And these things are quite common sense. I'm sure you know all of it already. The first one is the availability of nutrients. So if I had a bottle of water, and today I was thirsty, so I drank maybe half the bottle of water, and then I threw it in the back of my bakkie. And next week I'm driving to a client somewhere in the N1 on the Karoo, and I forgot to buy me a bottle of water, and I'm thirsty, and I see this bottle rolling around under the back seat. Now, I remember I already opened it, and I drank on it a week ago. I didn't even refrigerate it, and I see this bottle of water, and I'm very thirsty. Would you drink it? No? Yeah, very scurvy. I would drink it. And I'd probably be okay. I know there's some others that would drink it too, you're just shy. I'd probably be okay. Now let's change the story. Let's say I had a bottle of orange juice, and I drank half the bottle of orange juice, and I threw it in the back seat of my car, and a week later in the Karoo at 35 degrees Celsius. Would you drink that bottle? I'd probably get stopped for drunk driving because it'd probably be full of alcohol by then, right? So the only difference between the two is the nutrition. Water does not have any macronutrients like proteins, carbohydrates, fats, or anything that bacteria can use, but the orange juice does. So bacteria is going to grow a lot faster in an orange juice compared to water. So when you're busy preparing your food and you need to decide when you're going to mix what, you know, try and add the nutrition somewhere close to where you're going to process the food. Let's say you're doing canning. You don't want to make your sauce the morning, and now you're going to be peeling all your vegetables and doing all of those things. You want to first do that, make your sauce straight before you need to fill it, and then go straight into your cooking process. Because the availability of nutrients is going to affect how fast or slow bacteria grows. Then the availability of moisture. So maybe you're using some dehydrated material that you're going to use in your process. While it's dry, it is quite stable. But as soon as you rehydrate it or soak it in moisture, that's when the bacteria is now able to grow. Okay? It's the same like if you had a dried peach versus a fresh half a peach. The dry peach you can keep in your pocket even if you wanted to for many weeks and it would be fine. The fresh one, if you kept it in your other pocket, you're not going to have friends by next week because you're going to smell quite funny. Okay? And the only difference is the moisture content. I saw a hand. Okay, can we have the mic there?
I just wanted to ask you about peanut butter.
Yes.
During this process, this is a question I'm asking. Must we put, when we've opened up peanut butter, must it go in the fridge or do we keep it in our cupboard?
Okay. Who puts it in the fridge? Anybody? You put your nut butters in the fridge. Why do you put it in the fridge? Okay. 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 So she said she puts. Does it? So peanut butter, from a microbial perspective, from the microbiology, does not need to go in the fridge. Okay. Peanut butter's water activity is extremely low. Peanut butter is more fat than anything else. Okay. Normally, peanuts have a fat content of, in most cases, well over 50% fat. Okay, and there's hardly any moisture in there. If there was any moisture in peanut butter, you would become extremely ill from eating peanut butter, because peanut butter is not preserved in any way. It's simply just mold mixed with a few ingredients and then filled into the jar. So peanut butter, in terms of microbiology, in terms of controlling the bacteria, yeast, and mold, you do not need to refrigerate it. But peanut butters and other nut butters are quite susceptible to oiling out. You know, sometimes the oil separates. So if you want to refrigerate it to try and prevent the oil separation, that would work. Because the stabilizing systems that are added to peanut butter and also nut butters, They are types of fats that solidify at different temperatures. So if it's at a low temperature, these fats would solidify, so it will be difficult for it to oil out. Compared to in your cupboard, in these heat wave temperatures that we've experienced in the past few weeks, your peanut butter could separate because those fats that are keeping the oil stable now turn from a solid to a liquid. But that is not going to increase the microbial risk at all. Your peanut butter will still be quite safe. The mold that you mentioned and the issues that we've seen in the news lately with peanut butters, it's not related to during storage. It's related to growing on the farms and the harvesting and the storage before it became a peanut butter. Okay, so that's where the mold grows. The peanuts are supposed to go through rigorous testing before it's processed in a factory. And one of the very important tests is aflatoxin. And if it's above a certain level, it needs to be rejected, and then normally it goes for animal feed or something like that. So somehow some of these slipped through, and that's why we're seeing peanut butters being recalled. Okay, so that's moisture, gases. So you would think that if you take away all the air, you're going to stop bacteria from growing, and it's not the case. You will stop some bacteria from growing. We call those aerobic bacteria. But then there are many others that will still continue to grow. This dangerous organism that I told you about that grows at pH above 4.5 actually grows in the absence of oxygen. If you have oxygen, it won't grow. So if you just put something in your fridge or in your cupboard and it's just in an open pack, you don't have to worry about that organism. But as soon as you seal it inside of a container and the air is limited or the air is taken away, then that organism will start to grow. Okay, temperature we've covered when we spoke about chilling and freezing. So we know that we can control the growth rate that way. And then also we spoke about the pH and also chemical preservation. So as I told you, we got bacteria that falls into different categories. You see there, you even get bacteria that can grow at minus 15 degrees Celsius. These are quite rare, normally won't be a problem to you, but it's good to be aware of them. Psychotrophs, you remember, and we'll cover it later, you remember a few years ago there was a listeria outbreak in South Africa? So listeria will grow very happily in your fridge. You could have 10% salt in your product. 10% salt is a lot. You won't be able to eat it. It will be too salty. Listeria will still grow in that 10% salt solution. Okay? So you get quite hardy bacteria. The ones that we need to be especially scared of is the mesophiles. Those are the ones that grow at normal temperatures. Body temperature normally is the best temperature for them to grow rapidly. And this is where most of your pathogens fall into, okay? Including this dangerous organism that we're going to talk about shortly. And then I spoke about gas. So here you can see in that first test tube there, that's aerobic bacteria. They need oxygen to grow, so they'll only grow at the surface. But then you also get these other organisms called anaerobes. So they will grow where there's no oxygen. And then you'll get these other types, which are called facultative. So they don't really mind. They'll grow with oxygen or without oxygen. And then you get some funny types, which are called microaerophiles. They need not too much, not too little, just a certain amount, and then they start to grow. Okay? But this is just to make you aware that once you've removed the oxygen, you still need to control the bacteria. Your product is not safe yet. Okay, now we get to this infamous bacteria that I've been speaking about. Its name is Clostridium botulinum. Anybody heard that name before? You've heard of botulism? Okay, so this is the organism responsible for that foodborne illness. It is a gram-positive organism, meaning it has a thick cell wall, so you need to heat up to quite high temperatures to kill the organism itself. But it's also a spore former, so it produces spores. And these spores are extremely heat sensitive. So if I had to take that spore, I need to heat that spore up to about 121.1 degrees Celsius, and I need to hold that spore there for 3 minutes before I've actually inactivated that spore. So the question in your mind must be, but if I'm using a pressure canner that only goes to 116, how am I going to kill that spore? It means you have to keep it longer than 3 minutes, right? So that's why when you're processing products which have a pH of above 4.5, you need to follow a trusted recipe from a verified source, okay? Okay, so what does this organism do to you? I told you earlier that if I had to stick my finger in the jar that was contaminated and I licked my finger once, that would be enough to kill me. So this organism produces what we call a neurotoxin. So the protein that it produces is a neurotoxin. Once ingested, it works on your nervous system, on the human nervous system. So what would happen as soon as, if I had to ingest it, the first thing that would happen is I would start to speak funny. I'd start sounding like somebody that's intoxicated. And that's because the muscles that you use to speak are starting to become paralyzed. Okay? And then you start having blurred vision because you cannot adjust your focus anymore because the muscles that you use to focus your eyes is now also starting to become paralyzed. And then the last one, which actually kills you, is that neurotoxin goes into your bloodstream and it gets to your intercostal muscles around your lungs, and then it paralyzes those muscles, and then you suffocate to death. Okay, and this happens in a relatively short period of time. In the case studies that I've studied over the years, in my studies as food technology and also as a thermal processing specialist, when we look at the newspaper articles of where these things have been recorded, it's very sad. Oftentimes, the whole family will be found around the table where they were eating. Okay, and they're normally found a couple of days later by the neighbors or somebody that's looking for them. So it's important that if the pH is above 4.50, we need to make sure that we use a pressure canning system to deactivate this organism. Oh, and I told you earlier that you'll be able to smell and taste when something's wrong. Unfortunately, not with this organism. The toxin it produces is colorless and also odorless. It has no flavor. So it will smell fine, it will taste fine. The organism also does not produce gas. So it's not even going to look bulged or blowing. Okay? So you need to be sure that your process is safe when you are making high pH foods. So, yes?
Will it only happen in high pH foods? You don't have to worry about this organism.
You don't have to worry about it in most fruit products. Most fruit products are naturally acidic. Peaches, apricots, pears, you need to acidify a little bit. Guavas is acidic enough. Most tomatoes is acidic enough to prevent it from happening. And I say most tomatoes. Tomatoes here in the Western Cape area are generally quite safe. But tomatoes from other areas, especially up north, northern parts of South Africa, Mpumalanga area, there the tomato pH is actually quite high, and you have to acidify it if you're going to do a pasteurization process. So a temperature below 100 degrees Celsius. Okay? But when you look at, and I know I'm sounding like a stuck record now, but when you look at these trusted, verified recipes, even for acidified products, you will see in the recommendations, they will say add a teaspoon of lemon juice per jar. Okay? And the reason why they're telling you to do that is because they want to make sure that you don't become the statistic on the graph over here. Okay? So rather just add a little bit of extra acid if you're not sure, and that would be enough to prevent the growth of this organism. As long as the pH is below 4.50, the spores would be there. So in the tomato product we're going to make today, there's going to be Clostridium botulinum spores in there. But you don't have to worry about it because they're not growing. They cannot grow because the pH is going to be controlled. Okay? And it's the same for the products you make and even products that you purchase in the shop. So things when you're buying canned fruit or tomato sauces or chutneys or jams, they all have these spores in it, but it poses absolutely no risk to you because those pHs have been controlled. With other products, like if you had to buy a can of mixed vegetables or a can of beans or a can of mushrooms, it's been processed to a high enough temperature for a long enough time to deactivate all the spores, and that's why the product is safe. Okay? Yes. Paul, can you move the mic there?
How many cases of Clostridium infections or deaths are reported in South Africa?
So in terms of the amount of cases, not always published in all countries. Some countries might not even know they had these cases. But here you have an article, and I think I've taken this from America. Welsh. Okay, this is Wales. And here, so if you look on this graph, the orange line, the orange part of the bars, those are actually home prepared products. So home canning, which caused botulinum. The purple on the graph is where it came from some commercial producer. So I can't tell you the exact numbers. I can tell you that where people follow the trusted recipe and the process without changing it, most of the time you're going to be safe unless you change something dramatically. And even in commercial products, it's very rare. We have so many checks and balances in commercial factories. Part of what I do is I visit different factories and we check their processes to make sure that they are killing this organism adequately. And then we actually give them a certificate which they then keep, which is valid for 12 months to say that they are complying to all the times and temperatures and practices that they need to follow to keep it safe. Okay? Good. Okay, I think I've said all of this already. So if the pH is above 4.50, pressure canning. Okay? Water bath canning will not work. Boiling it in water is not going to work. Okay? You need to go to a high temperature. So earlier I told you that you could also use a combination process. If your pH is above 4.50, you could do a mild heat treatment, and then you will have to refrigerate your product. Okay? So the process that we use here is your product that you are heat processing, you need to get the core of that product. So what I mean by the core, the coldest point inside there. So everything inside of your package needs to be heated up to at least 90 degrees Celsius, and then you have to hold it at 90 degrees or above for 10 minutes. Okay? Now what that will do is, yeah, there we go. So this organism, this Clostridium botulinum, there are many different types which produce different types of toxins, and these different types also grow at different temperatures. So if you look here, we have group 2, which can grow all the way down to 3.3 degrees Celsius. So even if you mixed your product and you packaged it and you put it in your fridge is not below 3.3. I've tested many home fridges. Your fridge actually averages somewhere between 5 and 7 degrees Celsius. Okay? So that organism is going to grow in your fridge, it's going to produce its toxin, and it's going to infect whoever's going to eat that product. So that group 2, luckily for us, is quite heat sensitive. So if we hold it at minimum 90 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes, we will inactivate that group. So then it's only group 1 that will still be alive in that product. Okay? But look at group 1. It only grows above 10 degrees Celsius. So now, if you refrigerate, you will be safe. As long as your fridge stays below 10 degrees Celsius. Okay? If it does go over 10 degrees Celsius, then the organism will go into that lag phase. It will start to produce its enzymes to digest the food. And if it stays if it stays above 10 degrees Celsius, it will enter into that exponential phase. Once it's in that phase, that is where toxin production starts. So you need to make sure your fridge is working well and you keep the food below 10 degrees Celsius. Yes?
I just have a question. I know with load shedding, the food industry is experiencing a lot of problems. Maybe you can just talk to that, those problems.
Yeah. So first I want to say that we can't blame load shedding for food spoilage. So what I mean by that, if we know load shedding is a problem, we can't expect the public to forgive the food industry for food going off. So the food industry has to take measures to overcome the problems that is experienced because of load shedding. So most food factories have installed backup power, either solar or generator. Most of them is diesel generators. So then they are not affected by load shedding anymore. They have, when power goes off, the generator goes on and everything carries on as normal. In smaller companies where they maybe cannot afford to put in these expensive systems, they've been affected quite greatly. So they actually have to stop production when load shedding happens. I've had a few clients where we went to go and study their process, and we actually worked out how they can safely either continue going or how long they can stop without the food deteriorating to such a level that it has to be thrown away, where it can still be processed. Yeah, so most of the smaller companies that doesn't have backup power, they would be affected quite greatly. If you are running a business where you need chilled storage, well, then you just don't have a choice. You either have to close down or you have to put in backup power. But there's just no other way you'll be able to do it. Fortunately, if the load shedding is very short, let's say 2 hours, that doesn't really greatly affect your cold store, even your fridge at home. And we've tested this, that's why I know. So we put data loggers inside of the fridge and we check what happens to the temperature during load shedding. And it actually doesn't drop that much if it's a 2-hour load shedding. More than 2 hours, yes, it does drop significantly, or increase significantly, yeah. Okay? So that's Clostridium botulinum. You going to remember that name? Okay. When I'm training in the industry, they have to write a test and they have to make sure they write that name correctly. And otherwise they don't get the marks for that particular point. Yeah. In the industry, the people working with thermal processing, they have to be trained, they write a test, they must be deemed competent, otherwise they have to go pack boxes or do something else. But so in the food industry, the measures are quite stringent to make sure that the food is safe. So if you don't remember, Clostridium botulinum, C. botulinum is another term that everybody will understand, or simply just C. bot. If you say C. bot, then people will know you mean Clostridium botulinum. So that's one that you should remember. Then we get to this organism, which is Lactobacillus. The reason why I've included Lactobacillus, it is a food spoilage organism. It is non-pathogenic. It's what we were talking about earlier, that you use for the fermentation that you do when you're fermenting vegetables, when you're fermenting sauerkraut. I think your wife asked about sauerkraut. Yes. So even sauerkraut, that is Lactobacillus. So it's a good bacteria, but unfortunately, it causes spoilage. So if it grows in your product, it's most likely going to produce an acid. The acid it produces is lactic acid. And many times it produces large amounts of gas. So if you add a packaged product, let's say you're doing home canning and you're using these home canning jars, it will produce so much gas that the lid will start to bulge. Eventually it might bend and the lid might even shoot off the jar. Okay? So it's a spoilage organism, because once the seal on your package is breached, that's the end of the shelf life of your product, right? Because it's the same like opening it. So then the product is going to spoil within a few days after that happens. So this organism, as you can see, is gram-positive. That means there's a thick cell wall, so it is actually quite heat resistant. You need to heat your product to 85 degrees for a good few minutes to be able to kill these numbers of organisms. And as I've said earlier, they will grow in an acidic environment. So even if you're only making tomatoes or fruits, low pH things, you still need to work very hygienically. In 7 out of 10 of all the food spoilage investigations that I've conducted. So what happens is in the industry, people that manufacture food, mass production, sometimes they have problems in their factory and food spoils or products fail. And then they will contact people like me, and then we will go out, we will investigate what happened. And in many of the cases, it's a hygienic issue, and it's Lactobacillus, which caused the spoilage. And the reason why it happens is because they have set cleaning frequencies, and maybe somebody skipped one of the cleaning frequencies. Or maybe the cleaning process means rinse down, detergent clean, rinse down again, and then sanitize. And then maybe somebody didn't clean out properly with the detergent, so there's still high organic loads of food in the line, and when they come with the sanitizer is ineffective. So then you still have large amounts of Lactobacillus in the production line. The same will happen in your process at home, when your cutting boards, your knives, your tabletops. If you're blanching in water that's not changed often enough, then this organism can become quite a nuisance to you. It won't make you sick, but it will spoil your food. And then I mentioned Listeria earlier. So there's Listeria. You see those little tentacles coming out the side? So Listeria can actually swim around in your food. So it will eat and grow in one place, And when conditions become unfavorable because of the byproducts it produced, it will simply just swim to a different part of the food and continue growing there. This organism will grow in your fridge quite happily. Okay? Your fridge will have absolutely no effect on Listeria. And even, as I said earlier, even it's quite halo tolerant, meaning it can withstand high salt contents quite easily. This organism is pathogenic. So it will make you sick if you had to consume any foods where this organism had been growing. It's quite a nasty illness. Not everybody will die from it, but if you are immunochallenged, maybe you're a bit older, or many people nowadays might have HIV or some other immunocompromised illness, then it will be quite dangerous. Okay? So that's Listeria. So remember, even if you refrigerate your food, this organism can grow. This organism is easier to kill with heat than the Lactobacillus on the previous slide. It can be killed with heat at 70 degrees Celsius for a few minutes. You'll inactivate Listeria. I must also say that if you ever have a Listeria problem, it means that you have really unhygienic conditions. So if you work cleanly, and if you sanitize your surfaces, and you're using good quality raw material, you will not have a problem with this. Okay? Likes to live in drains, those kind of areas. So don't take your raw materials to the drain. Okay? I know it sounds funny, but trust me, when you are busy doing home preservation and you got big batches that you're making that you can't handle in your kitchen, then maybe you're going to do it somewhere, and now you need to pour the water off, and now you're pouring it straight into the drain outside the kitchen. You know, these things happen. So be very careful. Listeria, most commonly found in drains. Yes. So this will grow in dairy products. It likes dairy products, cheeses, because cheeses have high salt, they are acidic, so many other bacteria can't grow, so Listeria will grow. Meat products, you know, it's actually, you know, we have specifications in the food industry, and on raw meats, you are allowed to have Listeria. So raw meats naturally have Listeria on it as well. So it has to go through a process that's going to take care of it. So meat products, processed meat products, dairy products, quite susceptible to this organism. Okay, so now you've acidified your product, it's low pH, and now you're good to go with water boiling or water bath canning, okay? 100 degrees Celsius or below. So Clostridium botulinum is no longer a risk for you because you've controlled your pH, right? So which is the next organism now? So the organism that's going to spoil your product is Clostridium pasturanum, or its cousin, Butyricum. These ones can grow at low pH. So they will grow at around pH 3.8 to 4. They can still grow. They are quite heat resistant. They produce spores as well. But if you hold it at about just over 90 degrees for about 5 minutes, you would have killed enough organisms. So I'm mentioning all these temperatures now. But I'm not telling you how long to cook your product in a water bath canner or in a pressure cooker. And the reason for that is because there's many variables. So that's why when you now produce these products, you understand it better, you know why you're keeping it for that time and temperature, but you're not following these times and temperatures that I'm telling you, because this time and temperatures is at the core of the product. I think I might cover it later, but those recipes from a trusted, verified source that you will be following, there is somebody that actually studied this and put those parameters there. I will show you later when we do the practical demo how we actually do that. So we have special data loggers. It's little thermometers that has a computer and a hard drive and everything inside of it that we put inside the container, in the core, in the cold spot, and then we process it. And then we can download the info from the data logger afterwards, and we can run calculations to determine if we've killed these organisms or not. And that's how we actually set these parameters. So it's not something that's easily done. You need very sophisticated equipment to do it. And when you see this, a good source is the FDA. They have home canning booklets that you can download, which has the full procedure of how to make the product, what time, what temperature, and they even tell you at different altitudes what what time and temperature you need to use. Okay? And when they stipulate those parameters, that's how they would have done it. Okay? So this organism, just over 90 degrees for 5 minutes in the core of the product would be enough to keep the product safe. I was going to skip this one, but if anybody's doing milk processing, you know, they always warn you, don't consume any unpasteurized milk. Have you heard that before? And then if you speak to French people and people that are cheese connoisseurs and all these boutique cheeses, they will tell you that the best way to make cheese is to use unpasteurized milk. And they're right. Because of the proteins that have not been damaged by the pasteurizing process, you can get better texture cheeses and so on, which I don't recommend you eat at all. Unpasteurized milk has the risk of this organism called Coxiella Burnetii, which causes Q fever. Now, this organism doesn't grow in the milk. It's just naturally occurring from the udder of the cow. Okay? It doesn't grow, it's just there. The problem is, you only need one cell, one of these cells, to make you sick, and you can potentially die. Okay? So that's Coxiella Burnetii. So if you were doing dairy products, you need to pasteurize it for 30 minutes at a minimum of 63 degrees Celsius, or 15 seconds at 72. That's what we use in commercial production. Still a big problem. Still lots of people getting sick from unpasteurized or incorrectly pasteurized milk products. And that's it for the microbiology section. Any questions? One question here.
When you hear food poisoning, what's the most prominent and from what?
When you hear food poisoning, what is
the most prominent and from what?
That's a tough one. Cindy, you want to help me? What's the most common? It's different for different foods. So like meat products, let's say chicken, which is quite common in South Africa, then normally it's salmonella. Okay? And the reason is because of the way chickens are farmed and the antibiotics that's used in the farming practices. So it sort of results in these superbugs, which is antibiotic resistant. And if the chicken is not cooked properly, or even the chicken is cooked properly but it's not handled correctly. So you handle the raw chicken, and now the same person handles the cooked chicken. So in the cooking process, the organisms would have been deactivated, but now when you take it out of the oven, you put all the organisms back on again. And then somebody can get sick of it. In a well-operated deli in the shop, they've all been trained, so the person putting the chicken in the oven is not the person that's going to take it out, a totally different person, so that there's no cross-contamination. But meat products, very commonly salmonella, probably listeria also, mild listeria cases. E. coli is also quite common. E. coli is because of people not washing their hands correctly. E. coli lives in your digestive system. So when you go to the toilet and you don't wash your hands and sanitize it properly, E. coli will be on your hands. And if you're then going to work with food, you'll transfer the E. coli to the food. There's also another organism called Staphylococcus aureus, which lives on your skin. Some people are carriers, so they carry it in their nasal passages and their throat. And if they work on prepared foods, so foods that are ready to eat, they can infect it with Staph aureus, and then you can get sick from that as well. Okay, so the next section we're going to look at is chemistry. So we've been talking about this biochemistry and these changes that takes place in the food. We're going to look at just two main areas, which you might come across while you're doing home preservation. I'm going to talk about the browning and discoloration. There's different kinds of browning reactions that take place. So we're going to go through each one of them, so that if you encounter one of those browning reactions, you know what it's caused by, and then you'll know how to fix it. And then we're also going to just very quickly look at starches and hydrocolloids. Okay, so browning and discoloration, we get different types of browning that happens to your food. Okay, so sometimes when the food is brown, the first thing people want to do is they want to start reducing the temperatures and the time in the canning process to try and prevent the browning. That's not the right thing to do. Whenever you're doing home canning, you cannot adjust the time and the temperature. Okay?
that is fixed, cast in stone, can never be changed. But if you understand what's causing the browning, you can reduce the browning while still keeping the same time and temperature. So the first browning reaction I want to cover is what we call Maillard browning. Okay, so Maillard browning is a complex series of chemical reactions that take place when heat is added to food, and that food contains proteins and sugars. So a simple way or simple example would be if you had white bread that you're going to toast. So when you slice your white bread, or when you use sliced white bread, it has a nice light color, and you put it in the toaster, and if you watch it, there's nothing happening, nothing happening, nothing happening, and then all of a sudden it starts going brown. And if you leave it there just a few seconds longer, it goes black. Okay? So what's happening there is, it's not caramelization, it is actually Maillard browning. So it's a series of chemical reactions taking place between the proteins, the sugars, and the heat. Now, what happens in Maillard browning, there's so many different molecules that are being produced by these chemical reactions, that's why it develops flavor. So a toasted slice of bread tastes very different from a fresh slice of bread, okay? Because of the Maillard browning reactions. The color also changes, it becomes darker, but there could also be negative effects. If it carries on for too long, the flavor becomes undesirable. Okay? The color changes might be too much for what you want the color to be. And then you wouldn't want to eat the food. So if you are having Maillard browning in your products, you should not adjust the time and temperature, but you can adjust the sugar content, or you can adjust the ingredients that is adding protein to the product. Okay? So you can reduce those ingredients, and then you will reduce your Maillard browning. Okay? So that's Maillard browning, similar to what happens in baking of bread or toasting of bread. Then the next one you get is enzymic browning or enzymatic browning. Like for example, if you had to bite into an apple or cut an apple and you left it there for a few minutes and you come back and you'll see the apple turned brown. That's purely due to enzymes. Okay? So the enzymes, as soon as you cut the apple and the enzymes detect that there's air, the enzymes start to work and the fruit will discolor, or the vegetable for that matter. Now, a way you can prevent this from happening, who can guess? Like we did with the carrots, eh? You blanch it. You can blanch it to deactivate the enzyme. So if it was apples or other fruits, you can simply dip it in hot water, close to boiling, for maybe a minute or 3 minutes, depending on the temperature of the fruit and the size of the fruit. And what that would do, it would inactivate all the enzymes around the outside of the fruit. And then I heard you mention lemon juice. Lemon juice, yes. You can also change the pH, like we discussed earlier. So let's, for example, say you're making an avo dip, and you wanted to keep the avo dip for 2 or 3 days. If you put lots of lemon juice in there, and you blend it up nicely, mix the lemon juice everywhere, your avos won't turn brown, okay? Or your avo dip won't turn brown. The same for fruits and vegetables. If you had to dip it in an acidic solution, that might be enough to prevent or to slow down the browning process. Okay? So when you are processing large amounts of fruits or vegetables, always a good practice to give it a mild blanching straight after you've cut it open. Okay? That's just to switch all the enzymes off so that they don't discolor. So that's what you see visually, but also that the enzymes do not break down the network or the structure of the fruit. Then you get oxidation. So oxidation is where you have air that's in contact with the food, and it's the oxygen in the air which reacts with the food, which causes it to discolor. So if you're doing home canning, and you put your products inside of the jar, and you know they always say you must have a bit of a headspace inside of the jar. Now that headspace contains air. But when you put your hot covering liquid in the jar, then that air gap fills up with water vapor. Not steam, but water vapor. So the water vapor sits there and it pushes the air away. So when you put the lid, so straight after you've hot filled your jar, you need to put the lid on as quickly as you can. And what you will notice is, a lot of times that water vapor will condense, and before you even screw on the ring on the jar, it would have already formed a vacuum. And that gives you an indication that you've removed quite a bit of air from the top of the jar. If you don't do this, a month after the product was produced, it will probably be okay. 2 months, it will probably be okay. 6, 8 months later, when you open it, the top might be discolored. It will go gray or black. Okay? And that's because of the air that is still in the top. It is not microbial. It will not make you sick. It is purely aesthetic. Okay? So it just doesn't look nice. Maybe it won't taste nice either. But it's not going to make you sick, but that is oxidation. And then the last one, which is caramelization. This is where sugars are heated up to a high temperature. So sucrose, the sucrose molecule breaks down into glucose and fructose, and then when more heat is added, that sugars actually turn brown, which is called caramelization. So it's important to understand if your food is discoloring, that you're trying to preserve, which mechanism is causing it, so that you can then address the problem. Okay? So let's say the problem was sugars that was caramelizing. You're making a jam, and your jam is very dark. Okay? So ways around that is you can add your sugar later on in your jam mixing process. So first heat everything up, all the liquids, all the fruits, and then add the sugar in. So instead of the sugar being there from the very beginning of the heating process. Because when you've got a large pot on the stove trying to make jam, it's going to take a long time before everything heats up. So it's easier to heat up your liquids first and then add your sugars last. So then your sugars are exposed to less heat, and then you will have a better color, for example. Any questions on discoloration? Yes.
When can you add the sugars in? So you're cooking up your jam, and can you cook it up for like 2 hours or hour, or if you're trying to reduce the water, and then add your sugar? At what stage should you add the sugar then?
So let me think, are we making a jam process? We are going to go through a jam process later, but just very quickly, when you're making a jam, you want to heat everything up. The reason why you're adding your sugar is because you want to get your bricks or your total sugars in the mix up to about 60-65%. Okay? So the sugars doesn't have to be part of the mixture while you are heating it up. Let's say you're starting off with some water and some fruit, or some juice and some fruit. It's better to heat that up first, get it up to temperature, and once it's boiling, then slowly start adding your sugar in. So your sugar isn't there from the, ambient 25 degrees Celsius up to, let's say that's close to boiling point. Because also once you add your sugars, when the sugar content in the mixture increases, you actually increase the boiling point as well. So when you're making jam doesn't boil at 100 degrees like water at sea level. Jam actually boils maybe at 106 or 108 degrees Celsius because of the sugars that you've added. So you want to keep that boiling process as short as possible. You need that boiling process because when you boil sugar in the presence of acid, what happens is we say you are inverting the sugar. If you had to look at the sugar molecule, it's a carbon structure with hydrogen and hydroxyl groups, OH and H's in the structure. And when you heat it in an acid, these hydroxyl groups and hydrogen groups actually start swapping around. And you want that to happen because you don't want to have sugar in your jam, you want to have invert sugar, because invert sugar doesn't crystallize. Okay? So if you didn't boil it enough, you're going to get crystallization. So you'll have like hard pieces of sugar in your jam. So I would add it towards the end, and if you know your jam recipe well enough, you'd control the amount of water that you're adding, so that you don't have to evaporate for so long. Okay?
Cordial and jam, how do you keep the color?
Okay, I'll give you some quick tricks. So the color degradation is mostly because of the cooking process, so it's the sugars that are caramelizing. So like I said, add the sugars as late as possible. Try and keep the cooking process as short as possible. And then if you can get a hold of some ascorbic acid. Okay, ascorbic acid is the chemical name for vitamin C. You can add a little bit of ascorbic acid. That also helps with color retention. Vitamin C or ascorbic acid is a powerful antioxidant. So any color changes related to oxygen being present in the product or oxygen coming in from the headspace, the vitamin C or ascorbic acid will react with that oxygen, preventing reaction with the food. Okay. Good. Okay, so then we go to starches and hydrocolloids. So maybe in your recipe, you are using a starch. So starches are anything like cake flour, corn flour. Maybe it asks you to add some gums, like xanthan gum or other gums that you can get in the shop in your recipe. So it's important to understand how these molecules work. Starches, for example, are long chain molecules. Okay? And all these molecules are arranged in starch granules. Now, the way I like to explain it is picture a balloon. Okay? And you've got all these starch long chain molecules inside of the balloon. When you heat the starch up in liquid or in water, imagine this balloon being blown up. So the water that was on the outside is now absorbed into the balloon and it's blowing up. Okay? So the starch granule is swelling. We call that process gelatinization. Okay? You are gelatinizing your starch. And that's what gives you the viscosity. If you think about it, small balloons will be easy to stir, but a lot of big balloons, it's much more difficult. That's where you get the viscosity from. Now, these starches are quite sensitive to a number of things. The two main things that they are sensitive to is high shear. So let's say you're mixing, you're finding it difficult to mix with a spoon, so now you're using a blender or you're using a stick blender. When you start cooking the starch and the starch starts to become thick, you can't use your stick blender or your food processor anymore. Because what will happen is the blades will actually start chopping up these balloons and you'll lose viscosity. Okay? Now, if the balloon breaks, if the starch granule breaks open and these long starch molecules, these starch chains, they then leach out, what will happen after you cool down your product, these chains form a cross-linked network, like a big spider web. And then your product turns into a jelly, which you might not want. It won't be portable anymore. You'll have to scoop it. Okay? So those are starches. So they are susceptible to excessive heating. Will cause this balloon to burst. It will cause the starch granule to open up. High shear, which is stick blending or using a food processor or something like that. And also low pH environments. So if you're trying to thicken something that's already very, very acidic, normal starches like cake flour or corn flour is most probably going to break down. So you're going to add it, it's going to give you a little viscosity, and the viscosity is going to just disappear, okay? Because the granule is being affected by the acidic environment. If you wanted to thicken an acidic product, then you'd rather use a gum. You can get things like xanthan gum quite easily in Pick n Pay and in those places. Xanthan gums with a X, X-A-N, xanthan gum. Works better in a low pH environment, in an acidic environment. Okay, we finished with all these chemistry and microbiology stuff. I'll just show you a couple of pictures of the equipment, and then we're going to look at the equipment that you need for home canning or home preservation. So in the factories that I work in, this is some of the pieces of equipment that we use. It's basically the same like a home canner. It's a lot bigger so that you can do a lot more packages at the same time. The one on the top right corner over there, that one is able to process 500 cans per minute. Okay? So it runs at quite a high speed. The one on the bottom right-hand side, that one is quite versatile. It can process jars, cans, pouches, plastic containers, any type of packaging can go in that bottom one. So these two on the right-hand side and also the one behind the label, these are pressure cookers. So these ones we use to go to temperatures well above 100 degrees Celsius. That one on the top right-hand side, with one of my clients, we've taken that up to 132 degrees Celsius. Very high pressure. But then, same like we do water bath canning or boiling water processing, in the industry we do that as well. So these are tunnel pasteurizers or tower pasteurizers. These ones operate between 90 degrees and 100 degrees, similar to what you would do when you're doing water bath canning or just boiling water processing. Okay, that brings us to what you would maybe make use of when you're doing home canning. So what do you need? You're going to need your canner. When we go shortly, we'll move to the wall and we'll do a demo. And then you'll see these pieces of equipment there. There are different types. Yours might not look the same as mine, but I'm quite sure it's going to have the similar components. You'll need a pressure canner or an autoclave. If you're going to do high pressure processing, if you're going to do products that have a pH above 4.50. What you will also see when you have these trusted recipes from verified sources, they will give you, for products that have a pH below 4.5, like tomatoes or fruits or whatever, they will even give you a process if you add a pressure canner. Because if you're using a pressure canner, it means you're going to get to a higher temperature, which means the time can be shortened. Okay? So they might give you both options. And then you can choose which option works best for you. If you're going to go and use a pressure canner for fruits or for tomatoes, then because of the higher temperatures, the texture is going to be a lot softer. It might have a more cooked flavor. The color might be a little bit darker. Okay? But it's going to save you maybe half the time. So you need to decide what's going to work for you. We're going to do tomatoes, and because we are pushed to time and it's a demonstration, I'm going to do it under pressure so that it only takes half the time than what it normally would take. Okay. You need to have packaging that can be hermetically sealed. So the word hermetic, what we mean by that is it's a total airtight seal. Once you've sealed it, there's nothing that can get in and there's nothing that can get out. Okay? Because we want to pasteurize or sterilize the contents of the container. So we cannot have anything coming into the jar after we've pasteurized it. Otherwise, that makes our whole pasteurizing or sterilization process null and void, because then bacteria will get in. So it must be able to be properly sealed. We're going to cover the packaging shortly. Like I've been saying all day, you need to use a proper recipe and a proper process so that it can be safe. You need to have gloves so that you don't burn yourself. Make sure your gloves don't have a hole in. I had a colleague once who stuck her hand in a pot of boiling water to take a jar out, and there was a hole in the glove, so she burnt her hand quite badly. So make sure you don't have holes in your gloves. It's good to have a thermometer, so you can just double-check temperatures to make sure what the temperature is. These thermometers is relatively cheap nowadays. You can get one for like under 100 Rand even. And then it's also good if you can use if you have a jar lifter. You know, then you can simply pick the jars up. I'll show you one when we get to the foyer. So if you look at the actual pressure canner, what it's made up of, it has a heating element. So my one has a heating element, so I can actually just plug it in and it will start heating the water on the inside. Other types of pressure canners, you have to actually put it on a stovetop or on a gas burner, and you heat it up that way. It must have an airtight lid. Okay? The reason why it must be airtight is because we want to pressurize it. If we can't pressurize it, we're not going to be able to get up to 116 degrees Celsius. So the lid must be airtight and your seal must be working quite well. If there's steam and vapors coming out places that shouldn't be coming out, then your canner is not in a good condition to be used. You're not going to make safe products with a canner like that. Okay? It must be able to be sealed properly. It must have a vent on top, an air vent. So what happens when you start the process, as we're going to do later on, we're going to switch it on, it's going to heat up, and then all the air needs to be expelled from the container so that we only have hot water and hot steam inside of the container. If we've got air is an insulator, so you'll have cold pockets inside of your canner. So if you have any product that is exposed in that area of the air, it will be under-processed. It won't reach the temperatures that it's supposed to reach. I've done tests in my autoclave that you will see now, where I've put temperature loggers inside the water and temperature loggers in the headspace to see what is this temperature difference that they keep speaking about. And it was dramatic. 14 degrees Celsius temperature difference. Okay? The difference between killing somebody and giving them something nice to eat. Just the air. So it must have an air vent so that we can release the air. For your safety, it must have a safety valve as well. So this means when the pressure cooker gets to a certain pressure, the safety valve will open and it will blow off steam. So it won't allow the pressure cooker to go over a certain pressure because the walls can only withstand X amount of pressure. More than that could rupture the vessel. And if you have that happen, somebody's going to get burned quite badly. Okay? So it must have a safety valve, and then it must have at least a pressure gauge. And in most cases, the pressure gauge will have a dual scale. It will show you the pressure and it will show you the temperature as well. The temperature you need to take with a pinch of salt, because that temperature is not always going to be right, depending at what altitude you're at. Okay, as I said earlier, so remember that. Wrapped in love. So you need to wrap all the food in love. You need to use some sort of packaging. You are most likely going to use glass jars with lids and rings. Okay, these are quite easily available. You can speak to me or you can speak to Paul if you need to know where to get these at a good price. They're available in Cape Town, just around the corner where you can get them. But in the food industry, we make use of different types of packaging. But no matter what kind of packaging we use, there are certain requirements that the packaging must comply to. So the packaging must be resistant to heat. There are certain types of plastic that are resistant to heat, but like the plastic that your water bottles, that you buy water in, that plastic is called PET. That's not resistant to heat at all. Between 50 and 60 degrees Celsius, that plastic will start to deform already. Okay, so the plastics that are resistant to heat is plastics like HDPE, modified polypropylene, those kind of plastics. But they are not really available in a form that is conducive to home preservation. Okay? So we use it in the industry, but we have very specialized equipment, very specialized sealing technology to seal it properly. So the ones that's most easiest to use is going to be glass with metal closures. The container must be able to be hermetically sealed, so we must be able to seal it. It must be airtight. It must be able to withstand pressure. Even if you're going to do water bath canning, even if you're just going to do it on your stove in hot water, when you put that container into the hot water and the temperature increases on the inside, it's going to generate quite a lot of pressure. Okay? In most cases, you're going to generate up to 100 kPa, even more. Okay, and the container must be able to withstand that pressure. Yes, and you want it to be puncture resistant. So, for example, maybe one of the days pouches is going to become quite easy to use. Pouches are really inexpensive. It's like R1 a pouch, R2 a pouch. You just need to have a special sealer to be able to seal it. But the big problem with pouches, because it's a flexible material, it is susceptible to puncturing. Okay, so there cannot be any sharp objects anywhere. Your surface that you're going to store it on needs to be smooth so that there's no puncturing. And then there's also lots of seals to worry about when you're using flexible packaging. So glass is going to be the packaging of choice that I would recommend for now. Until home canning becomes a little bit more sophisticated, then we can maybe move on to other types of packaging. So glass, it's important to know that flint glass, so flint is just a fancy word for transparent glass. So you get flint, you get green, and you get amber. So you'll be making use of flint, which is the transparent glass. Transparent flint glass has a thermal shock temperature of 45 degrees Celsius. So what does that mean? That means that if the temperature difference is more than 45 degrees Celsius, you'll get thermal shock. I don't know if you've seen thermal shock. If you take a hot jar and you put it in cold water and it bursts, that's thermal shock. So you need to make sure. I know many guidelines do not recommend fast or forced cooling. They always say you need to pack your jars on a table, on a cloth, with spaces in between, and leave it for 24 hours to cool naturally. So that is the recommended way of doing it. If you want to be a rebel and you want to fast cool, you need to make sure that the temperature difference is never more than 45 degrees Celsius. So you'll have to gradually cool the glass. If you don't, you will experience thermal shock, which is quite dangerous because the glass is going to shoot everywhere, and you're going to lose all your product. There's nothing you can do with it after the glass is broken. So the lids, you all have seen the lids. I will show you some of the lids when we get inside. The lids are metal, but it's actually made of tin plate. Okay, so it's the same material that is used to make tin cans, is used to make those closures. On the inside of the lid, you will see like a white paint, if we can call it that. That's the lacquer. So the lacquer is a coating to prevent the product from making contact with the tin, okay? Because it's a very thin tin coating. Now, the tin coating structure is it's tin, iron, and then tin on the outside as well. And then the outside will have maybe a transparent lacquer, maybe some decorative printing, which will tell you the name and the brand of the lid and so on. But inside, that lacquer is very important. So usually, I would only recommend that you use the lid once and don't use it again. Okay, rather buy new lids. If the lid has got a scratch on it, or you can see that that coating has been damaged, rather don't use it, because your shelf life is going to be drastically reduced. If you're making, let's say you're making guavas in a glass jar, and you've got a scratch on your lid, I don't think you're going to even make it to 1 year. Okay, the guavas are going to eat right through that metal. It's going to pinhole all the way through to the outside. So it's going to pinhole. That means a microscopic hole. So it's going to rust till it gets a microscopic hole. And because you hot filled your syrup onto your guavas, you have a vacuum on the inside. So as soon as you get that microscopic hole, it's going to suck air in. Small amounts. You might not even notice it. But that air will contain bacteria. And then the bacteria is going to start to grow. And it's going to start pushing product to that hole. The product might reseal that hole because it's a microscopic hole. And then your product will start to blow. And then you're going to be very concerned, oh, my other jar is safe. Okay? But then it's just because the lid was scratched. So handle the lids very gently. Don't use any metal, forks, knives, or anything near the lids because you want to keep all those coatings intact. Make sure that your jars, which you can reuse them quite safely, as long as you clean them properly. Okay? They must be well cleaned. You can either sanitize them or you can simply just use hot water to clean them after you have already washed them out. So you must wash them with warm soapy water, rinse it well, and then dip it in hot water or leave it in hot water till you're going to refill it again. And don't use any jars that have any chips or cracks on it, especially on the finish, you know, the rim. If there's any chips or cracks there, you're not going to get a seal. Okay? So there has to be a proper finish for you to get a seal. So the right way to operate your canner, you must make sure your jars are clean. It's a good practice to put the jars in hot water before you're going to fill it. So that has two key effects now. The hot water is going to kill bacteria, so your jars are going to be quite clean. And secondly, if you're going to hot fill your product in there now, your jars are already at 80 degrees Celsius. Okay? Let's say you were going to hot fill a jam, and the jam was at 108, and your jars were just at room temperature in winter at 15 degrees Celsius. The moment your jam goes in that jar, the jar might burst. Okay? But now, because the jar is 80 degrees Celsius, that temperature difference is below the 45 degrees Celsius, so you won't get thermal shock. So it's good to always preheat your jars. We have a question?
We have a question online. Vivian Leroux is asking, can you please recommend brands of pressure canners available in South Africa and where to buy them?
Sure. Bram, if you can comment back, if she can send us the details, and then we can make contact with her. I don't have a specific brand to recommend. It's also not something that's very commonly available in South Africa everywhere. Everybody I've spoken to has inherited their pressure canner from somebody. But if we can get the details, we can maybe speak to offline. I don't have a recommendation on which brand to buy. Okay. Then, whether you're doing water bath canning or whether you're doing pressure canning, it's good to preheat everything, keep it ready. You don't want to have all your jars ready, and now you need to wait to heat the water because it's cold. Okay, so rather preheat everything, get it up to 60 to 80 degrees Celsius. And when you place your jars inside of the canner, even if you're doing water bath canning, make sure that your jars are fully submerged. The water level must be above the lid. Okay? And we normally have a rule of thumb for every 30 minutes to an hour, you need to have about 2.5 centimeters of water. So let's say I'm going to go for 2 hours, I'm going to need 2 times that, maybe 5 centimeters of water, because the water is going to evaporate. Okay? But keep an eye on it, especially if you're doing in a pot or you're doing water bath where you can see the liquid level. You don't want that liquid level to drop below the surface, because you might end up with a cold spot at the top of your jar. Okay. So when you place the jars inside of your cooker that you are using, try not to overfill it. Okay, the pressure canner or the water bath canner, or even a pot, you don't want your jars to be in contact with the metal. Okay, and you want to have at least some space between the jars so that the water can move and the temperature can spread. You don't want to trap a cold amount of water in between your jars and it doesn't get a chance to heat up. Okay, you want to make sure that you have space around it. You need to close the lid of your canner properly. The seal will wear out over time, especially if you have your canner for a long time. So then you need to have a place where you're going to get spare parts to replace that seal. So make sure that it's sealed properly so that we can get to the correct pressure. We have one more question online.
How long should you leave the bottles in the boiling water, in your open boiling water container?
Okay. How long should you leave it? It's according to the trusted, verified recipe that you are following. So different products would need different amounts of time in the boiling water. So the recipe would tell you, place it in boiling water. When you place it in the boiling water, it might stop boiling because the jars might have been colder. So then you allow it to get back up to boiling point and then you time your process. So whatever the recipe says, that time is not from the time you put it in, it's from the time that you've reached the temperature that you want to be at. So if it's a pressure canner, you wait until the pressure canner gets to the pressure setting that it needs to be on. Then you start timing the process. If you're doing it in hot water or a water bath, you place it in the water, you make sure you can see that the water is boiling, or you use your thermometer to check that you are at boiling point for the altitude that you're at, and then you start timing the process. Okay? There isn't a one time for all products. Each product would have a different time. Okay, so if you're doing pressure canning, you close the lid, and now you allow it to heat up further. You're going to leave all the vents open, okay? Because you want all the air to escape from inside of the canner. So you would, that takes at least about 10 minutes. You will start seeing your pressure gauge wants to climb, but it can't because the vents are still open. And after 10 minutes, you can close your air vent. Only your safety valve will still be able to blow. And then your pressure canner will get up to its set point pressure. Then it will be at about 116 degrees Celsius. Once you see it reach that pressure, you can then start timing your process. So you need to regulate the temperature as well. So if you have it on a stovetop, you're going to start your process off probably on maximum temperature to get it up there. But once you are at that temperature, if your safety valve starts to blow off, you can gradually reduce your temperature. You just need to make sure that the pressure doesn't drop below the pressure set point for your particular cooker that, or canner that you have. If you did have a problem, so let's say it's a load shedding, or you ran out of gas in your gas tank, or something happened that the temperature dipped, then what you need to do is you need to get it back up to temperature and start from the beginning. So if the time was 40 minutes, if you had a temperature drop at 20 minutes, you get it back up and you time a new 40 minutes. Okay? That's the safe way to do it. If you read in all the home canning guidelines, that's also what they will say there. You remember, we're dealing with a dangerous bacteria, so you rather want to be safe. So that's why that recommendation is like that. Okay, then once you get to the end of the holding time that you had for that recipe, you'll switch off the heat and you will allow the temperature to gradually drop. You don't want the temperature to drop too rapidly because then the pressure is going to drop very rapidly. Remember I said when you heat these jars or these containers, the internal pressure inside of the jar is quite high. So now the outside pressure that you've generated with the hot water inside of your pressure canner is providing a balance for that internal pressure. Okay? So it's balancing that pressure. So you want that balance to gradually drop, not suddenly, because your lids might just pop off if you drop it too quickly. Okay? So that's why you gradually drop it. And when there's no more pressure inside, so how do you know when there's no more pressure? You simply look at your pressure gauge. Eh? If your pressure gauge is not working, you shouldn't use your home canner, your pressure canner. You look at your pressure gauge. When the pressure is down to 0, then with a glove on, you can open your air vent just to make sure any residual pressure will then escape. And when you open the lid, you'll open the petcox or you'll twist your lid, however your one works. When you open it, don't open it towards you so that you can see inside. Okay? Always open it away so that all the steam vapor moves away from you. It will be very hot inside there when you open it. Okay? When you take your jars out, if you were doing pressure canning and you pack your jars on the table, you'll probably see it still boiling inside of the jar. Okay? It's at a very high temperature, so you don't want to burn. And then you will remove it, place it on a table where there's a nice cool breeze, and allow it to cool gradually. So I told you earlier, this time, thanks Paul for that question, the time is what everybody wants to know. But this is one of the formulas we use when we are actually calculating the holding time for the product. So I will show you, when we move into the wall now, I will show you some of the equipment we use. We place this equipment inside of the jars, we collect temperature data, we calculate the lethality or the destruction of the bacteria, and each product will have a specific time and temperature based on these calculations. Okay? And based on the actual organism which we are trying to inactivate. So if we were doing pressure canning on mixed vegetables in a salt water, then we will definitely be targeting Clostridium botulinum, and then there's certain parameters that I would plug into this formula to calculate for Clostridium botulinum. If we were doing canned tomatoes, which has a lower pH, and now we're pasteurizing, then we'll have a different target organism, which is probably going to be the Butyric anaerobes, or Clostridium pasturanum, or Clostridium butyricum. Then there'll be a different set of numbers that I plug in for that organism. So we need to know which organism we're targeting, and that's how the recipe is structured. That's why you must follow the recipe, and that's how the time and temperature is given in the recipe as well. So it's been predetermined. So nobody can guess this, okay? So if somebody asks you, you've been doing canning for a long time, I want to make canned peanut butter fish paste, okay? Some crazy product. And you're like, oh yeah, man, 85 minutes. I think that will work for that. That's not how it works, okay? It is scientifically calculated with trials, collection of data, and many, many mathematical calculations. Different things, but it will be helpful for you also so that you can see what's happening. So mine has a digital temperature control. Your one won't have that. And my lid has a few extra valves because we do some other different things. So, but yours will have two vents. So one is the safety valve, and the other one is the air vent. Okay. So we'll leave that there so long. So this particular autoclave has an internal element. So there's a power cord that's connected to the electricity. It's like a kettle. You know, like when you switch a kettle on and it heats the water on the inside. So there's this type. Then there's also the other type where you need an external heating source where you would put it on a gas stove or an electric stove, and then it will heat up that way. Okay. So today we're going to do some tomatoes. We're going to do whole peeled tomatoes in glass jars. Where's Paul? We got some tomatoes? Yes, or we can just use these. So a quick and easy way to peel tomatoes, I'm sure you all use that method, is to just dip it in boiling water. What will happen is it will heat the flesh of the tomato just under the skin. It will cause it to boil. Yeah. No, it's fine. We can just and when you take it out, because it has boiled just under the skin, it would have generated pressure there, and if you just touch it with a knife, it will just split open and it will peel off. Okay, so that's how we're going to do that. Let me just. No, I think we'll be okay for now. Okay. Okay, so here I've got water boiling. And I've got a glove, hopefully with no holes in it. So you also get these kind of thermometers, which is quite nice. You can use it for jam. It will show you where's the boiling temperature of jam and so forth. So this is just to double check the temperature. So your tomatoes would have been thoroughly washed, and then you're going to peel them. So we just dip them in. And we're going to leave it there for a minute or two. Can I project on you? While it's peeling, I'm just going to show you some of that temperature, altitude combinations that I spoke about earlier. Can I have a volunteer to come and assist me with my sauce? Okay, there we go. So if you can empty this out into the pot. So it's 700. So to make the tomato juice, you could use your tomatoes that you're already busy processing by just blending it and straining it to get the juice out. Or if you wanted to, if you had a lot of tomato paste, you could use tomato paste. So commercial tomato paste has been concentrated about 5 to 6 times based on fresh juice. So if you want to dilute it back down to juice, you just dilute it with 5 parts of water. And then you'll get back down to fresh juice concentration. Oh, is it? Yes, you can change it. Okay, so we're going to make a little bit of juice. And that's going to be our covering liquid. I spoke earlier about citric acid. So this is what it looks like. It's a white powder. It's very easy to work with. It dissolves very quickly in water. If you use it, you can either use it dry, or I would recommend you make up a solution, around about a 30%, 33% solution. So 1 part of powder to 3 parts water. Get it to dissolve, and then that will be your concentrated acid solution, which you then add to whatever you're making. If you do it in liquid form, it will heat up. I mean, it will mix in a lot more quicker. Okay. So we're going to simulate a pressure canner today. So I just want to change the temperatures here. Okay. So we're going to go up to 116. So I'm opening the vents so that we can allow all the air to escape. Our tomatoes should be ready. Oh, I spoke earlier about the jar lifter. This is what it looks like. So it's quite an easy gadget to just lift your jars out of the cooker afterwards without burning. Here's my helper. So can you add about 300 moles, 350 moles of water to this? Yeah, you can just get there. Cold water's fine. So you see it just rubs off. And then you hardly lose any flesh and you've got all the skin off. Okay? You don't need to, but it might burst later and it might be floating around in your jar. It's just aesthetic, but it's not a problem. Okay, you can just heat it up. So we're going to bring our sauce to boiling point, and then it will be ready to add onto the tomatoes. Here we go. Okay. And the mix. So that's our covering liquid. Just till it boils. We seem to have a power issue. Let me plug this one straight in. We'll go to our backup plan. Okay. Okay, it's okay. We're having some trouble with the TV. Let me just talk you through it. So if we had to look at Cape Town, our altitude is about 31 meters above sea level. So it's basically sea level. And our boiling point here in Cape Town is 100 degrees Celsius. So if you're using a home canner in Cape Town, you're going to get up to 116 degrees Celsius inside of your home canner. Now, if you were in Bloemfontein, Bloemfontein is just under 1,400 meters above sea level. Water only boils at 97 degrees in Bloemfontein, and your home canner in Bloemfontein, the same one that you use in Cape Town, if you had to take it to Bloemfontein, is only going to get up to 115 degrees Celsius, so it's 1 degree less. And that same home canner, if you took it to Joburg, which is just under 1,800 meters above sea level, where water boils only at about 96 degrees Celsius, you're only going to achieve 114 degrees Celsius. Now, you might think that that temperature difference is very small. Now, if I had to relate that to an equivalent cook time to inactivate Clostridium botulinum, okay? So it's just a comparative number I'm going to give you. So in Cape Town, if I needed 9.7 minutes at 116 to inactivate Clostridium botulinum, in Bloemfontein, I'm going to need about 13 minutes, okay? And in Joburg, I'm going to need 15 and a half minutes. So the time is different because of the temperature that you get to. So it's important that when you're following a recipe, the recipe must tell you whether it's been developed for sea level or for altitude and at what altitude.
So it's a strong smell of gas.
Okay, thank you for that. You will not get the strong smell anymore. Is it simmering? Yeah. So here's the jars and the rings that we spoke about. I'm sure you might have seen them. So here you can see that coating on the inside, which we call the lacquer. There's also a coating on the outside, a clear coating, which is protecting the outside from corrosion. If you see any corrosion marks, like I've got one here, you can pass it around so that you can see. So here's corrosion on the outside, and there's also damage on the inside. So then this is a type of lid that you would not want to use. So these jars come in different sizes as well. So this is a 500 ml. You also get one that's closer to a liter. The times and temperatures in the recipe is specific to the jar size. So you cannot use a recipe for 500 ml and use that same recipe for a 1 liter. Okay? The time will be very different. So we have the tomato juice preparation. That is our covering liquid. So if I had to put tomatoes in the jar and I didn't have any liquid around it, it's going to be very difficult to achieve heat transfer once I go into the pressure canner. Okay? So the liquid that you put in actually helps with the heat transfer because the heat is going to go from your pressure canner or your water bath canner. It's going to heat up the glass, and the glass is going to heat up the product on the inside. So the liquid that you put over your product actually acts as your heating medium to transfer your heat to your product. So we'll just do a quick demo here. So like I said, you try and preheat your jars. So you'll use hot water to preheat your jars. Before you fill. Yes, you do. So that's the other thing. Thank you for that. So on your lids, you will also notice in the sealing surface, the part that goes onto the surface of the jar, onto the finish. If you rub your finger in there, you'll feel it's a different kind of material there. Okay? That material we call the sealing compound. So it's like a rubber gasket. And the way this compound works is, at the moment now, because it's room temperature, it's not very flexible. It's quite hard. But if I preheat the lid, and that's the right way you should do it, you always preheat your lids. That gives your lids a bit of a sterilizing effect. But more importantly, it softens this compound. So that when you now put your lid on your jar and you tighten it, you are able to squeeze that compound over the surface of the jar. The surface of the jar is not a perfect finish. It is not 100% straight. Okay? So that's why you need this compound to actually squeeze into the gaps. So thank you for that.
Notice when I can, and like 10, 15 minutes later, you hear this little click.
Yes.
What is that?
That is the vacuum that's forming.
That's sealed.
Yeah. So let's try and simulate that quickly. No. So this you can only use once. The ring you can use multiple times as long as it's still giving you a seal. And theoretically, once your jars come out of the canner, once they've cooled down to room temperature, you should actually be able to remove the rings and use it on another jar. Because the vacuum that you formed should keep this on here. I'm going to see if we can create that vacuum quickly. Yeah. Let's see if this will work. No, we can't do it now. You'll see the vacuum when we fill it. So in factories, what we do when we're putting the closures on, we actually blow steam between the product and the lid. So it's all automated. And it traps that steam between the product and the lid. So now all your air has been displaced. You only have steam, and it forms a very strong vacuum. You can do that at home by making sure that your liquid that you're filling is at a very high temperature, and that you put your lids on very quickly after filling. Okay? Okay. Now, we're just going to do a quick demonstration. We haven't finished the prep of everything, but you would have peeled all your tomatoes, and you would have filled your container. Okay, and then you've got your hot covering liquid. So now when you fill it, you want to leave a headspace. Okay, you need to have a headspace because what's going to happen is. Oh, sorry, just a minute. You want to have a headspace in your container because when you heat the liquid up, it's going to expand and you need somewhere for that liquid to go. If you filled it up all the way to the brim, when it goes through that expansion, it can actually damage your lid because then you form a hydraulic pressure on the inside. Okay? So if you fill to just in the neck, that should be enough. Yeah, like a centimeter, 1.5 centimeters should be fine. Okay? And then while you're waiting, it's good to leave your containers upside down. So now you've sterilized your lid as well. And also, you will see if there's any leaks. Okay?
How come when you do your canning a few minutes later, you find that the jars, this comes loose and you've got to keep tightening? Why?
It's because it's forming a vacuum. So these lids, they seal when they're under vacuum, but when they're under pressure, they don't seal very well. So as you go through the cooking process, there will be some minor leakage to the outside. So that's hot vapors that is escaping. And then when it cools down, the air would have escaped with that as well. So when it cools down, then you form quite a strong vacuum. And then it will pop in. If you tightened it well enough beforehand, you don't have to retighten it again. Yeah. Unless it's leaking. Yeah. Are you also heating your lids up beforehand?
Everything. We heat the whole thing, but we've noticed we have to tighten it, and then we go back again, and it's still loose, and we've got to tighten it again.
Yeah. You don't have to keep tightening it. So once it's tight, it's tight. Unless you're worried about it leaking, but it shouldn't really leak. Yeah. Okay. So we're having a problem with the power at the moment, so we're going to go to water bath method. Let's see if this works. Yeah. Oh no, we're not using that one. Oh, let's see. Spell that one. I'll just give it a minute. Maybe it's heating up now. Okay. While that's continuing, let's quickly go through some of the other.
Just want to know, did you sound a recipe that you know exactly 5 tomatoes will fit in that jar?
Yes. So you asked earlier where to find these recipes. So the most reliable source that I can recommend is this one here. So this is the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. There's different chapters that you can download for different products, and then also for different techniques, pressure canning and water bath canning. So if you scroll through here, oh, sorry. There we go. So USDA, you can just Google this, and then there will be a number of downloads that you can download. And if you look through it, you want to take a photo. Yeah. And if you go down, so here's all the procedures. And if you had to look at, let's go to whole peeled tomatoes, let's crush tomatoes. Whole or halved. So it will give you the whole procedure, how you're going to fill it, the different size jars. This is all, unfortunately, in American. So we'll have to convert it to, what do we use? Metric. Metric system, but that's not too difficult to do. And then here, whether you're packing it in water or you're packing it in juice. So here's tomatoes in juice. And then it gives you your 2 jar sizes, and it also tells you what the processing time will be. And then you'll see there's different columns for different altitudes, depending on where you stay. Okay, so these have all been verified. This is not the only source. There are other sources as well, but this is a quite complete list of products that you can follow over here.
Where do you buy your jars from? They can be quite expensive at some places.
Yeah, the most common is Console.
You buy directly from them?
Yeah, there's a shop that you can go to where the public can purchase. I think that's the... Yeah, that's the most cost-effective. Yeah, but they're reusable, eh? So it's an investment. Yeah. I'm not sure if we're going to get all of that to work, but while it's going there, we were talking earlier about sauerkraut and fermented products. So we'll quickly just go through a process and what the different steps, what the importance of the different steps is. So when you're making sauerkraut, so sauerkraut, for those of you who don't know, is fermented cabbage, and the fermentation is by Lactobacillus. It produces lactic acid. So first of all, you need to prepare your cabbage by removing the outer heads. You need to wash and rinse it properly. And the reason why you do this is because you only want to use a certain part of the cabbage, which you're going to eat. And also you want to remove any FOs, foreign objects. Okay? Maybe a snail or two, or a worm, or some sand or stones that might be trapped in between. You want to get rid of all of that. Okay? You cut it in quarters so that you can get the core out, and then you're going to thinly slice it. So if you like thick, chunky pieces, it's not going to work very well for your sauerkraut. You need to cut it nice and thin. The reason for this is because you want to expose surface area, and you want to allow the liquid to exude from the cabbage as well. You could, but then you need to use quite the fine side of your grater maybe, so that you're at that 2 millimeter slivers. Okay. Then you're going to mix it with salt. Okay. Now the recipe will give you a specific amount of cabbage and a specific amount of salt. If you want less salt, your recipe might be a bit dangerous. Okay. Because the salt is actually a very functional ingredient in this whole process. So when you add the salt to your cabbage, what you are actually doing, you are reducing the water activity. Okay? Remember we spoke about the water activity? So you're binding that moisture that is available. So on your cabbage, there's a whole spectrum of microorganisms. There's bacteria, yeast, and mold, all on your cabbage. But you only want your fermentation organism to grow, which is Lactobacillus. So when you add the salt in the right ratio, you are actually cancelling out the other organisms. You're preventing them from growing. And you are promoting the growth of Lactobacillus. Okay? So it's important that you use the right ratio of salt to the product. Then it's always a good idea to add a weight on top to keep it down so that you can submerge all the cabbage below the liquid level that will come from the cabbage itself. If there isn't enough liquid, then you need to make up a salt solution to try and simulate the concentration of salt that you're going to actually achieve from the naturally exuding water and the salt that you've added, so that your cabbage is fully submerged under the water. Then you're going to have to store the container in some dark place somewhere. It takes a good few weeks. Depending on how much lactic acid was naturally occurring in your or on your cabbage. And when you see all the bubbling stops, that shows you that the fermentation process is now complete. The reason why we always say a dark place is because UV light also catalyzes the product, or it catalyzes some chemical reactions. Especially when there's naturally occurring fats and oils in your product, UV light will cause fats to oxidize and go rancid. So you can get some changes that happens in your product. So it's always good to keep it in a cool, dark place. And once you've finished with the fermentation, you will notice that the cabbage is now no longer neutral flavor, but it's quite acidic. And that acid that you taste is the acid that was produced by the lactic acid bacteria. And that is actually what is keeping the cabbage fairly shelf stable if you refrigerate it. There's also another thing that happens with bacteria. It's a phenomenon that we call competitive inhibition. So what that means is, if you have a whole lot of one bacteria that is growing, okay, so in this case Lactobacillus was growing, just the fact that Lactobacillus is growing, that will inhibit the growth of other bacteria because that organism is growing best. So even though you might have other organisms that you don't want to grow, the fact that you've selected now correctly for Lactobacillus, the fact that that's growing, it will prevent the growth of most other bacteria. Okay? So this is a fermented product. The reduced water activity, the reduced pH because of the lactic acid that's been produced is good enough to keep this product stable if you refrigerate it as well. Okay?
So we don't have to worry too much about those dangerous bacteria when we ferment.
If you follow the recipe, you don't have to worry about it. Yeah.
I was a bit worried earlier when we spoke about it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so you see, if you cut the cabbage thin enough, you're going to get the right amount of surface area. You're going to get the right amount of liquid. The salt's going to penetrate quickly enough. Your lactic acid bacteria is going to grow. It's going to immediately start dropping the pH. And once the pH is below 4.50, you don't have to worry about Clostridium anymore. And did you follow the recipe of the sugar, the salt, and the?
They said that my family told me it was too salty.
Okay.
No, we never followed the recipe.
You didn't follow a recipe.
We wanted to measure. No, we didn't measure. We just
Okay. It's important to measure. Yeah, it's important. Get a little kitchen scale to measure these things. You must measure it. A lot of recipes will give you volumes as well. So if you don't have a scale, oh yeah, it needs to be 2 millimeters. Yeah, that's a bit. So by the time everything happens, there was too much of a delay, and probably other bacteria took over. So the same competitive inhibition happens. So if the wrong bacteria starts growing, then Lactobacillus is not going to grow. Yeah, so you don't want that to happen. You want to select for it early.
The thing is, they were saying you mustn't put the jar when it's tight in the beginning.
Yes, because it's producing gas. You want that gas to be able to escape.
So once the bubbling stops,
then you can close it and put it in the fridge. Yeah, and also when you put it in the fridge, you're going to stop whatever Lactobacillus was still growing as well.
So when you close it, like the bubbling stop, you close it, it must go to the fridge. You can't keep it in a cool room.
No, it must go in the fridge. And it's also a limited shelf life. So a couple of months, a couple of weeks in the fridge. You should have eaten it by then.
If you want to make a lot,
Yeah, you must rather make more frequent batches instead of a whole lot at once. Yeah, because look, what you want. I saw your two hands. We're going to come to you now. What you want to happen is the reason why we make fermented products is because we want, when we eat those products, we want to consume live bacteria. We want to consume the lactic acid bacteria because it's healthy for you. So you don't want it to have a long shelf life in any case, because the longer it sits, that lactic acid bacteria is going to go into that death phase. Then you're going to be consuming dead bacteria. Okay? So, I mean, even if you look here, you can even do a boiling water process on there to extend the shelf life, but I'm not recommending that, because when you put it through that process, now you kill the lactic acid bacteria. So now you've got the flavor of sauerkraut, but you don't have any of the bacterial benefits, no probiotics. So you've actually defeated the purpose of, you could have then just taken sauerkraut, added citric acid or something to acidify it, and then, save the 6 weeks time that you left it to ferment, because you don't have any of those benefits now. So you need to make it, let it run through its fermentation process, and then consume it before the bacteria dies, so it can be beneficial to you. After you've, I would say a couple of weeks. Yes, if you refrigerate it, yes. Yeah. But, you should be so excited that you got live bacteria in your fridge that's healthy for you. And then you should eat it with each meal. And Yeah. It's very healthy. It's good for your digestive system. Did I get your question?
What do you use as a weight?
Okay. You could just use a heavy jar to put on top there. You could also fill a bag with water. Now, not just any bag, not like a black bag that you use for refuse, like a bag that you'd normally store food in. You could use that as well, but with fermentation processes, you just need to be careful when you use that kind of bag because it could also seal off the top. So if you're going to use a bag, it's quite nice because you put it on top, you fill it with water, and it naturally takes the shape of the container that you're using. Okay, yeah. But glass weights are good because there's lots of space around it, so the gas can bubble out quite easily.
You was talk that when you're doing your sauerkraut that you mustn't use a metal bowl or whatever because it affects the cavity. Is that true? It has something.
It depends now what metal.
Stainless steel.
I don't think stainless steel is going to be too bad. Cindy, is there anything wrong with stainless steel? No? We use glass normally when we're doing, even when I studied at Tech, we used glass, but I can't think of anything that sauerkraut is going to do to a metal container. There is something. So even stainless steel. It's because of the high salt content. So even stainless steel will corrode in a high salt content environment. So the stainless steel could become pitted after repeat usage. So you'll...
That won't affect your sauerkraut.
No, but it's going to affect your container. Yeah. So you're going to use your container a couple of times, then it's going to be pitted and you're going to have to throw it away. Yeah. Did we cover all the questions on sauerkraut? Yes.
Will you know how you know if you were growing the wrong bacteria? So something went wrong now. How will you know if it's the Lactobacillus or if you were growing the wrong one?
Okay. So when Lactobacillus grows, there is no off odors. Okay. It doesn't produce any off odors. It produces only a sour taste. Okay. So if you're detecting off odors or something that doesn't smell like sauerkraut, then you know you've cultivated the wrong bacteria there. Color is difficult unless you've now by error selected now a yeast or a mold. You know, then you'll see these groups of them growing after maybe 2 weeks or so. But color is going to be difficult. It's more going to be on the odor and on the flavor. If you're worried, if it already smells wrong, then you have to discard it. If it smells okay, but you're still worried, then just have a little taste. It must have the typical lactic acid sour taste on the liquid. But if you followed the recipe and the instructions, you shouldn't have a problem. And I think after you've done it a few times, all the problems will sort of solve themselves, as long as you're following the recipe. All good on fermentation? And fermentation is quite similar, no matter what you are fermenting. Very important to follow a verified recipe. Okay? So that's more of a liquid. Yeah. And kombucha might be a different organism. That might not be Lactobacillus. I think that might even be a yeast fermentation. Yes. So we don't generally do that one.
Yeah, we just have a question from online. They're asking if freezing will kill the bacteria in sauerkraut.
Okay. No, not necessarily. Freezing doesn't kill bacteria. There are some bacteria that could die when you freeze a product, but in most cases they will just become static. So they will stop all their growth, but when the temperature comes back to their optimum temperature, they could start to grow again. So freezing or refrigeration does not kill bacteria. Okay.
Sorry, if you got questions, if we can just use the mic, please. Thanks.
Freezing again, when you said there is some bacteria that can still grow in a freezer, on what type of foods would that be?
So these bacteria that grow in the freezer, there's psychotrophs that can grow in the freezer. They're quite rare. They are not common. So if you ever had a problem with those kind of bacteria in your freezer, it is a very rare type of thing. in your fridge, there it's more common. So the bacteria like Listeria, for example, that will definitely grow in your fridge. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry, we're having a problem with the electricity here, or something's not right. So I think I'll go through one more process, and then we can just have a general question and answer, if that's okay. Let's do jam. Or is there a particular product that you'd like us to go through? Is there anybody that has? Sorry? Is jam a good one? Okay. Okay, so with jam making, you start off with sorting of your fruit. As I said earlier, you want to use fruit that is of acceptable quality. You want to remove whatever defective fruit or severely blemished or rotten fruit is in between. You want to take out foreign objects, leaves, stems, whatever else might be in between. And then the fruit will go through a preparation process. So certain fruits you might want to peel. Maybe you want to remove the pips, or you want to dice it or slice it before you make the jam. Some fruit products you might want to prick if you're making maybe like a melon and ginger jam or something like that. The reason why you would prick certain fruits is to allow for the sugar to penetrate into the fruit. Okay? And then you would mix all your ingredients. So ingredients generally is going to be the fruit that you're using. Maybe you're going to add some juice or some water. You're going to need sugar. Definitely you're going to need sugar. And then you will make up a pectin solution as well. And the jam is going to need to be acidified as well. So for the acidification, you're either going to use lemon juice or you're going to use something like a dry citric acid powder. Now pectin, just remember when you're working with pectin, pectin is not cold water soluble. So if you're working with pectin, you need to dissolve the pectin in hot water. Okay, pectin does not dissolve in cold water. So you dissolve it in hot water. Make sure it's fully dissolved before you add it to the jam mixture. And you don't have to add the pectin in the beginning. You can add the pectin right at the end. Okay, because pectin is also quite heat sensitive. You can damage your pectin if you boil it for too long. So the mixing process would be, you would start off with your liquid, your fruit. You would heat that up. Once you get to close to boiling point, you would then add in your sugar. That will dissolve quite rapidly and mix in. And then you will go through a very short evaporation process. I say short evaporation process because there's no point in adding liters and liters of water that you're anyway going to just need to cook off later. So if you follow your recipe, it will tell you exactly how much water, how much fruit, and it will also tell you how long you need to evaporate. A very quick way of checking is once all your sugar is in, and once you've added your pectin, and you've mixed your pectin in, if you take a little scoop of the jam out, and you put it on let's say a metal tray, or something where it can cool down very quickly. So you'll put maybe one spoonful there, like a tablespoon worth, on the tray, and you allow it to cool for a couple of minutes, maybe 2 minutes or so, and then you feel it with a spoon. You should already see it starting to set. Okay? Then you know you're at the right bricks. If it stays a runny liquid, then either you're not at the right pH or you've still got too much water in that recipe. What you can also use, I told you earlier, you get these refractometers. Any of you seen one of these? So these are very easily available. You can get it on Takealot even. So what you do, I'll pass it around. You just put a drop of product on the lens. And then you look through here and you'll see a scale. And I'll pass it around. Please don't drop it. And you will see there's a shaded area and a clear area. And where that line meets, that's the bricks. Okay? So if you're making jam, you get yourself a refractometer which can measure a range of above 45 bricks, because normally they come in a range that they can measure. And then you can very easily just put a drop of jam on there. Just look into the light and it will tell you what is the sugar concentration. Okay? If you do use it, maybe don't put the jam straight from the boiling pot at 108 degrees Celsius on there. Maybe put it in a tray first for a minute and then scoop it out and put it on there, just so that so that you don't crack the glass. If you're not seeing anything, then your eye is not properly behind the lens, or you're not looking into the light. Okay, so just move it around while you're looking. Okay, so now we mixed all our ingredients. We've evaporated. Straight after the evaporation, you can add your pectin solution. Remember, it must be hot so that it's properly dissolved. You mix that in, and then you're basically ready to fill. Now, as I explained earlier, when you go through that evaporation step, you are inverting the sugar, so that will prevent crystallization. If you do pick up crystallization in your jam, it means you need to cook it a little bit longer. Okay, you're not evaporating for long enough. So your sugar is still sucrose. You want to invert that sugar. Okay, you want to turn it into invert sugar. And then you can hot fill. Even in commercial factories where we make jam, we need to make sure that the filling temperature, the temperature before we put the lid on and we turn it upside down, must be more than 88 degrees Celsius. Okay, at 88 degrees Celsius, the yeast that we're trying to inactivate there is instantaneously killed. Okay, it's killed after 1 second at 88. So if you're at 88 and above, you're quite safe. Your jam will last for quite a long time. Okay. So with jam, you would want to cool it down as well. So you could let your jars air cool for a little while, and then you can place it in cold water. Remember the 45-degree temperature difference. The faster you cool it, the more firmer your set is going to be. Any questions on the jam?
Sorry, just repeat that. So the faster you cool it, the better the set. Explain that.
Yes. Because your pectin is forming a network. And as you cool the jam down, this network is strengthening. So if you can cool it quickly, and when I say quickly, I'm saying now instead of letting it stay hot for days on end. Once the jars are, it's still hot, but I mean you can touch it, okay? So now the temperature is probably about 50, 60 degrees Celsius. Then I would put it in cold water, just over there, which will actually help with the set. Don't shake the jar. Okay, when you're making jam, don't disturb it. So during the setting process, if you were to come and shake it, then you disturb the whole set, then you will end up with what we call a broken set. So it will look like jelly that was stirred. Okay, so you want to leave it still, and only once it's properly cooled and it's set, then you will move it around.
So you said cold water, you can add the ice to the water.
You can, or just tap water. Well, yeah, just tap water. That's cold enough. Tap water is going to be 20, 25 degrees Celsius. Okay. Okay. There's a lot more slides, but I won't keep you much longer. Is there any general questions, something that we maybe didn't cover that you were hoping to hear about in the talk today?
Well, I've got a question. If you, let's say you're making tomato puree, like something like this, how does it affect if you put like a bit of garlic in, you start throwing in other flavorants just to change the flavor? What do you have to watch out for when you start doing that?
Okay. So when you add things, one thing you must keep in mind, the spices are extremely contaminated. Okay? Spices have extremely high levels of bacteria. So if you are going to add spices, add good quality spices, and don't add too much. Don't change the recipe too much. But feel free to flavor it like you want to flavor it. If you're going to add spices, you know, if you're going to really, really make it spicy, where it's a really high concentration of powders, then you must know, especially if you're doing water bath canning, that you've now increased the microbial load quite a bit. So you're going to have to probably cook that longer than what the recipe says, so that you can inactivate more bacteria. If you want to try it, like let's say you were doing normal tomato, and now you want to do, what do you want to do?
I gave that jar to my friend.
Yeah.
So that's got here's the stuff in it.
This one.
You know that the jar stuff. Amina's in it.
Can I open?
I'm sure she does one line, and it's got a garlic in it.
Okay. While we're talking, we're going to. Okay. While we're talking, I'll just get the pH meter going, and then we'll check what pH you were at, if it was a safe pH. I can see you've got a good vacuum. The button is down, so it was sealed nicely. So we'll have a look at that. I think feel free to flavor how you want to flavor, but just know that when you're going to use spices, you're going to be adding extra bacteria. But I don't think in most cases you'll probably be fine unless you're going to start adding whole things. Like let's say you're going to start adding whole chilies, for example. Or you're going to be adding lots of chopped up onions. That's going to change your product quite dramatically. Is it all in there? Okay, we're going to see now. So let's have a quick look. So tell us what's all in here? Tomatoes and?
No garlic.
Basil. I've got it.
Oh, did you put garlic?
Sweet basil, and then I've got mixed herbs from Wells Centre, and then I've got amino acids in as well.
Okay, can I have a look?
And salt, and obviously it's garlic, and olive oil. What does that mean?
4.52. It's on the wrong side of 4.5. So this one, you'd need more lemon juice. Or did you add any lemon juice? Or yeah, you'd need more lemon juice. So you need more. You need to get it to below 4.5.
Thank you.
So now what must happen to that bottle? Not much really.
Yeah, it's really on the fence. So let me also tell you, depending which textbook you read, whether it came from the USA, whether it came from the UK or Europe, some textbooks will say 4.60 and some textbooks will say 4.50. So we here in South Africa, we agree with the UK, which says, well, if some studies said that it can grow at 4.5, then we will take the safer route. So I always recommend 4.5. If you were in America, you might be okay. But you know, Clostridium botulinum grows the same no matter which country.
Can you add citric acid to?
Yes, citric acid, lemon juice, yeah, any acid will bring it down. You need very little, eh? Yeah, but I would try and get it down further than what it is now. It could be that the tomatoes in your area is quite high pH. Wherever you got the tomatoes from.
The Heinz Orgal tomato.
Okay. So,
They
how is
came
it?
from Calvinia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it could be that where this was grown, soil conditions and so on created quite a high pH. So this one is quite high pH.
Should you then test the pH before you start the tomatoes?
Only with a pH meter. These are quite expensive.
Don't get manual ones.
This is as manual as it gets. If you get anything, you see, food is quite difficult to test. So you need quite a decent pH meter. So you can get really inexpensive pH meters that's used for water and for soil and for other things. But when you're testing food, you want to be as accurate as possible. And this particular pH is sort of the minimum that I would recommend. But they're quite expensive. This is probably maybe 12 to 15,000 rand for one of these. But did you follow a recipe for this one?
No, that was my own recipe.
Yeah.
But
So
I want to ask a question though. That was not a brand bottle, that was a yeast bottle. So I've got batches where I've got new constant bottles, and I've got batches where I've got that.
yeah,
That can't be a contributing factor to.
the bottle itself, no.
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 So it's
This is a fact. This is a function of the product itself. Yeah. So if you follow any recipe, like even on that USA reference that I gave you, for all the tomato products, they will give you a recommendation to acidify. Okay, and then they give it in terms of how much per jar, depending on the jar size. And then you can work that back and you can add it into your pot when you're doing your mixing. It won't affect the taste much. You probably won't be able to, did you hear the pop? That was the vacuum. You probably won't detect the difference in flavor between 4.50 and 4.35, for example. Tomatoes, you would expect to be acidic, so you wouldn't really, if you're sensitive to acidity. if you're going to do water bath canning or only up to boiling point, the pH must be below 4.50, so you have to follow the acidification recommendations in the recipe. But if you don't like the flavor, you can just simply add some sugar. Okay? If you take most soft drinks, yeah, we won't mention names now, but the black soft drinks, when you taste those, I know none of you drink that here, but you know, for those people who have tasted it before, that doesn't taste sour at all, right? The pH of that is in the low 2s. It's extremely acidic. That's why it works so well as a drain cleaner and cleaning the oil in your paving and so on. Because the pH is so low. The reason you don't taste it is because most of those in a 330 ml, 340 ml can has between 10 and 12 teaspoons of sugar in there. Okay? So you can't taste the sourness anymore because the sweetness is overpowering. So you could use that knowledge to your benefit. If you don't like it to be sour, add just a little bit of sugar. It's not going to change the pH, but it's going to change the flavor. So you'll neutralize some of it there. Okay, so that was that product. I just wanted to double check it. It really is 4.52, 4.53. And this is?
You said the other one is a tomato that was canned the same week as this, but that was Somerset West grown tomatoes.
Okay, let's check.
But sorry, before I go back to my corner there at the back, I just want to ask a question. I mean, there's quite a big movement now to use less sugar and less salt and less all this stuff. And if I listen to you, it's actually quite dangerous. So how do you go that approach health-wise, but still stay within your safe?
You can't use a recipe that's been developed, a safe recipe that's been developed with a certain amount of salt or a certain amount of sugar, and just take it out. So you would have to find a safe, verified recipe that is a reduced sugar or reduced salt, and then follow that one.
Okay. So I can't just replace my sugar with honey or...
You could do that, but then you must also understand that sugar is 100% sugar, and honey is only about 78% sugar. So you would have to replace 1 part sugar won't be 1 part honey. You would have to add more honey than what you have sugar. That's something that you can do. But there's a calculation that you'll need to do. Okay. So I'm not giving you a recipe or anything. It's not that we can't. We actually do this on a daily basis. We develop products for the industry, and it's safe products at the end of the day. But there's a process we go through. So I won't be able to just tell you what it is because we go through testing. We make up the recipe. We will be testing it. We'll test the heat penetration. We use these data loggers, which measure the temperature, record it, and we can download it later. And then we will specify the entire process from start to finish. How you prepare the raw materials, how you mix it, how long you mix it, what temperatures you need to go to, how you're going to cook it in a water bath or in a pressure canner, time, temperature. And even after we've done all of that, then we send it away for microbiological testing to verify, and then only we produce it in the factory. So all of that would have been done for you if you follow a trusted, verified recipe. Okay? But for you to do it is maybe going to be, But I'm quite sure that if you continually do your home canning and you continually study and read up and educate yourself, you will get to a point where you can actually start making some changes. So your tomatoes in Somerset West, can we have a look that I'm not telling lies? 3.79. Totally different to the Calvinia tomatoes. Okay, she added lemon juice. Okay. So that's 3.79. So this one would be fairly safe. No issues here on this one. And then let's do one more.
Sorry, so can I ask, if you're unsure, you just add a teaspoon of lemon juice?
Yes. Yes. That would be the safe thing to do. Yeah. Carob and mulberry, let's see. Is the refractometer still going around?
I must just give a disclaimer with the recipe. I never follow recipes. The mulberry juice wasn't made with mulberries, I used the juice. So I put the mulberries through the juicer, vegetable juicer.
Okay.
And use the juice. And then we weren't sure how to equal the sugar now, so we just kind of named it. So it's not like a jam, it's more like a soap.
And then what did you do? What did you do afterwards? Did you
boiled it till it was like a thick enough consistency.
And then you filled it in the jars, and what happened to the jars? Okay, and then you cooled them.
Yes.
Okay, so it's a high bricks, so you're well over 30. This refractometer only goes to 30. Let's check your pH. Oh, this is distilled water, or reverse osmosis water, RO water. And this last one, carob?
That's the carob syrup that I made from the carob pods.
Okay. Did you add any acids to this one?
I don't think so, I can't remember.
Okay. So this one looks okay, it's just stabilizing now. This is around about 3.84. So this one is quite safe for low temperature, hot filling, water bath canning, that kind of thing. Okay, and we'll do the last one here.
I didn't expect such a low acidity if there's that much sugar in there. If it's a sweet.
That's why you're not tasting the sourness, because of the high sugar content.
High sugar content.
Yeah, so it's masking it.
So Ravano, when you add lemon juice, how much would you need per, let's say, a liter or 500 ml? To change the pH?
All depends on which product you are busy with. Some products would need more than others. Like tomatoes. Let me see if I have it here. So for tomatoes, it would be about a half a teaspoon for one of these jars, or 2 tablespoons of lemon juice per jar. Okay, that would make it safe. Oh, let's check the bricks. The bricks is the sugar concentration. Yeah. So if a sugar concentration is around about, oh, I need to wash this. If the sugar concentration is roughly at about 60-65%, generally your water activity is in quite a safe range. Clostridium botulinum wouldn't be able to grow. Clostridium botulinum needs a water activity of around about 0.93, 0.92, 0.93 water activity. It must be above that for Clostridium botulinum to grow. Jams are generally in the 0.8, 0.85 range, if it has the full amount of sugar. Yeah, it's also quite concentrated. So this one's pH is 4.45, but I suspect the sugars here is going to be very high.
Yeah, well, it's just sugar. It's just.
Yeah. So and this one, how did you do this one? Did you evaporate it or?
Yes. So that was just the carob pots that I broke and soaked, and then I strained it off and cooked the water until I got the thickest consistency for syrup. So there's nothing else in there.
And then you filled it hot, closed it?
Yes.
Okay. It's probably okay. Can I take it with me?
Yes, you can.
I want to check what the actual bricks is. But I'll have to do that in my lab.
Can I ask something?
Yes, you can go ahead.
So can you develop recipes for us with less sugar?
We can. We can. That's what we do. We do new product development, packaging development, process, factory design. We do those kind of things. I will give you my details. Yeah. Okay. So this is just to show you the kind of tools that we need when we are making up these trusted, verified recipes. Okay, there's a lot of science that goes into it to make sure that that product you make is going to be safe. In closing, I think there's no more questions, eh? Everybody wants to go home now. In closing, I want to leave you with one of my favorite quotes. This is from a book called The Ministry of Healing, one of my favorite authors, Ellen White. And the quote is, "Our Heavenly Father has 1,000 ways to provide for us, of which we know nothing." So with that, I wish you all safe canning, safe home preservation. Follow your recipes, and I'll give out my contact details if you want to make contact with me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Ravano. Wow, I think we've learned a tremendous amount, and maybe we'll get you for a follow-up sometime. So yeah, thank you everyone for attending.
We'll make sure that everything's working properly that time.
Yeah, you've given us enough theory now, so we kind of understand how it all works. And your number will be available if people want to speak to you or contact you later.
Yes.
We'll make it available. And remember, our next one will be on the 14th of April, which will be doing solar power. And so once a month this year, we're going to be trying to do some skill. We call it essentials for moving out into the country, encouraging people to become self-sufficient and to be able to survive. And so we're going to be doing all these skills. And so then, yeah, the next one will be solar power and alternative energy. And Ravano, we really appreciate it. Thank you very much.